The Arizona desert doesn't forget. Beneath the scorching sun and endless sand lie 13 ghost towns where the dead refuse to rest, and tonight you'll discover why. These abandoned mining settlements were built on gold, silver, and copper, but they were paid for in blood, and the violence that soaked into their foundations never truly left. From a mercantile store cursed by back-to-back murders in the exact same spot, to underground tunnels where a headless miner still searches for what he lost, to a hanging tree that continues to cast its shadow over the living. These locations hold some of the most disturbing paranormal activity ever documented in the American West. The wooden buildings may be rotting and the streets may be empty, but something still moves through the darkness when the sun goes down, and locals have learned the hard way that some places are better left alone after dark. Welcome to 13 Ghost Towns, where history turned deadly, where the past clawed its way back into the present, and where every creaking board and shifting shadow might be something far more sinister than the wind. Jerome clings to the side of Cleopatra Hill like something that refuses to let go, and maybe that's exactly what it is, because everything about this town seems to hang on past the point where it should have fallen away into nothing. Founded in 1875 when copper was discovered in the Black Hills of Yavapai County, Jerome exploded into a sprawling mining operation that drew over 15,000 desperate souls chasing fortune in the Arizona desert. And what they found instead was a place so violent, so drenched in vice and bloodshed, that a New York newspaper gave it a nickname that stuck like a curse: the wickedest city in the West. The town survived 5 major fires that swept through and devoured entire blocks, leaving nothing but ash and the charred skeletons of buildings that had to be rebuilt again and again, each time on top of the ruins of what came before. Underground, hundreds of miles of mine tunnels were carved into the mountain, creating a honeycomb of darkness beneath the streets, where explosives tore through rock and killed miners in sudden collapses and cave-ins that buried men alive. In 1938, one of those underground blasts was so powerful it literally moved buildings, causing the city jail to slide 225 feet down the hillside, while the business district toppled like dominoes. And you can still see the ghostly remains of those structures today, displaced and broken, sitting far from where they were supposed to be. Then came the Spanish flu epidemic that killed more than a third of the population in a single sweep, overwhelming the hospital and morgue until they had to dig mass graves just to handle all the bodies. By 1953, when Phelps Dodge finally closed the mines after extracting $800 million in copper, the population collapsed to just 50 residents, and Jerome should have become another forgotten dot on the map, another ghost town left to crumble in the desert sun. But it didn't die, and maybe that's because the dead themselves never left. The stretch of Hull Avenue where the cribs once stood is where Jerome's darkness manifests most clearly, where the town's brutal past refuses to stay buried. These weren't the fancy brothels with velvet curtains and piano music that you see in Hollywood westerns. The cribs were tiny shacks, barely large enough for a bed, where women sold themselves for whatever miners could pay, living in conditions that were barely human, trapped by poverty and addiction in a system designed to grind them down to nothing. Violence was constant in the cribs, fistfights and stabbings and shootings that rarely made it into any official record because nobody cared what happened to the women who worked there, and their deaths were treated as just another cost of doing business in the wickedest town in America. One night in the late 1800s, in one of those cramped wooden cribs, a miner high on opium and rage drove his knife into one of the women again and again, leaving her bleeding out on the filthy mattress where she'd tried to make a living. Her body was discovered hours later, and the miner disappeared into the tunnels beneath the town, either escaping through the maze of shafts that connected everything underground, or dying down there in the darkness where no one would ever find him. The crib where she died was eventually torn down, like all the others in that section, and in its place they built Lawrence Memorial Hall, which locals know by a different name, Spook Hall. The name isn't a joke or a tourist gimmick, it's a warning, because from the moment that building went up, people started seeing her. She appears without warning, always in the same spot in front of Spook Hall where her crib once stood. A woman in period clothing from the 1880s, moving with purpose down the street as if she's heading somewhere important, somewhere she desperately needs to be. Witnesses describe her as solid and real at first, solid enough that some have mistaken her for a historical reenactor or someone in costume, but then they notice details that don't add up. The way her feet don't quite touch the ground, the way the fabric of her dress moves in wind that isn't blowing, the way she doesn't react to cars or people or anything happening around her. She walks with her head down, and those who've gotten close enough to see her face wish they hadn't, because what they see there isn't peace or rest, but something raw and trapped, an expression of pain or fear frozen across features that seem both present and impossibly distant. She always moves in the same direction, walking away from where Spook Hall stands now and heading toward the old hotel district, following a path that makes no sense in the current layout of the town, but might have meant everything when she was alive. About halfway through her journey, usually near the point where Hull Avenue starts to curve, she simply vanishes, not fading gradually like fog, but disappearing in an instant. There one moment, and completely gone the next, as if someone flipped a switch and turned off her existence. The first few times this happened, back in the early 1900s, people assumed they were seeing things, blamed it on bad whiskey or exhaustion or the thin mountain air playing tricks on their minds. But the sightings kept coming, decade after decade, reported by residents and tourists and skeptics who swore they didn't believe in ghosts right up until the moment they watched a woman in Victorian-era clothing walk through solid matter or vanish into nothing 3 feet in front of them. In the 1970s, when artists and free spirits started repopulating Jerome and turning it into the quirky tourist destination it is today, the sightings increased, or maybe people just started talking about them more openly. A photography shop owner on Hull Avenue reported seeing her multiple times, always between dusk and midnight, always following the same route. He tried to photograph her once, setting up his camera and waiting, and he swears he got her on film, a translucent figure moving past the streetlights. But when he developed the negatives, there was only an unexplained blur of light in the shape of a human form that skeptics dismissed as camera shake or double exposure. A couple visiting from California in 1982 watched her walk the entire route from Spook Hall toward the old hotel before disappearing, and they were so shaken by the experience, they cut their vacation short and left town the next morning. The man later told a paranormal investigator that what disturbed him most wasn't seeing a ghost, but the realization that she was trapped in a loop, walking the same path she probably walked thousands of times when she was alive, going from her crib to meet a client, or heading toward the hotel for some reason that mattered desperately to her then and still compels her now, unable to rest or move on or escape the routine that defined and ultimately destroyed her life. Jerome's paranormal activity isn't limited to Hull Avenue, though that's where the most famous manifestation occurs. The Jerome Grand Hotel, which was built as the United Verde Hospital in 1927, has its own collection of spirits, including room 32, where guests report being touched by invisible hands and waking to find shadowy figures standing at the foot of their beds. Down in the tunnels beneath the town, urban explorers and paranormal investigators have recorded unexplained sounds, footsteps echoing through passages that haven't seen human traffic in decades, and the sensation of being watched by something just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Local tour guides will tell you about the headless miner who haunts those tunnels, a man decapitated in a mining accident whose body was never recovered, but whose presence is still felt in the cold spots and sudden drops in temperature that occur in certain shafts. Throughout the business district, shop owners report objects moving on their own, doors that lock and unlock without explanation, and phantom smells from the past, tobacco and whiskey, and the acrid burn of ore smelting that hasn't happened here since the 1950s. The Connor Hotel, still operating on Main Street, has its own resident spirits, including a woman who throws carbolic acid that only she can see, forever repeating the violent act she committed there in a jealous rage over a century ago. But it's the murdered woman of Hull Avenue who remains Jerome's most persistent spirit, the one who appears most frequently and leaves the strongest impression on those who encounter her. Some paranormal researchers believe she's stuck in what they call a residual haunting, a psychic recording of events replayed over and over without consciousness or awareness, just energy imprinted on the location through trauma and repetition. Others think she's something more aware, a soul that knows it's dead but can't or won't move on, perhaps because she died violently and without justice, perhaps because she's searching for something she lost in life, or perhaps because Jerome itself holds on to its dead the same way it clings to that hillside, refusing to let anything go. The town has embraced its reputation, marketing itself as Ghost City and offering haunted tours that stop at all the hot spots. But locals will tell you the marketing doesn't capture what it's really like to live here, to walk down Hull Avenue alone at night and feel the weight of all that history pressing down, to know that the ground beneath your feet is hollow with abandoned mine shafts, and the air around you is heavy with the presence of thousands who died here in fires and epidemics and acts of violence that were so common they barely warranted mention in the local papers. Jerome never really died because death is what made it what it was, and what it still is, a place where the past and present exist simultaneously, where a murdered woman walks her eternal route past Spook Hall, and where the wickedest town in the West continues to live up to its name long after the mines went silent and the miners went to their graves. "88 miles of tunnels snake through the mountain beneath Jerome, carved out inch by brutal inch over decades of copper mining that made fortunes for men who never set foot underground, while the miners themselves descended into darkness every single day, knowing they might not come back up. The United Verde mine operated in conditions that would be unthinkable today, with men working in shafts so deep that the temperature climbed past 100 degrees, breathing air thick with rock dust and explosive fumes, using dynamite in spaces barely wide enough to turn around in, all for wages that kept them one step ahead of starvation, while the mine owners counted their millions above ground. Mining deaths weren't unusual. They were expected, part of the cost of extracting copper from stone, and the company kept operations running even as fires burned out of control in the lower levels, filling entire sections with smoke so dense it would pour out of the open pit and hang over the town like a toxic fog for weeks at a time. Between cave-ins, equipment failures, gas pockets, and explosive accidents, hundreds of men died in those tunnels, and most of their names were never recorded anywhere beyond the company ledgers that noted their final paychecks. But one miner's death stood out from all the others, not because it was more tragic or more unjust than the hundreds of deaths that came before and after, but because of what happened in the hours and days that followed, events that turned a mining accident into a legend that still haunts Jerome's abandoned shafts over a century later. Charlie was working deep in the tunnels when it happened. Nobody remembers his last name anymore, if they ever knew it at all. Just Charlie, another miner in a town full of men with picks and explosives, and desperation driving them into the mountain every morning before dawn. The exact date has been lost to time, sometime during the boom years when 4,000 men were working the mines simultaneously, and production ran 24 hours a day, with crews rotating in shifts that kept the tunnels full of noise and activity without pause. Charlie's crew was working a new section, drilling holes for dynamite charges that would blast loose another section of copper-bearing ore, and something went wrong in a way that mining accidents always went wrong. Suddenly, violently, without warning or time to react. The blast came early, or came too strong, or ignited a pocket of gas that nobody knew was there, and the explosion ripped through the tunnel with force that sent miners running for their lives back toward the main shaft, choking on smoke and dust, ears ringing from the concussive wave that had turned the air itself into a weapon. When they reached safety and counted heads, they realized Charlie hadn't made it out, and a rescue team went back into the smoke-filled tunnel to find him, hoping against experience that he'd somehow survived, that they'd find him injured but alive, trapped but breathing, anything except what mining experience told them they were actually going to discover. What they found was worse than anyone expected, even miners who'd seen their share of underground deaths and knew how brutal the work could be. Charlie's body lay in the tunnel where the blast had caught him, but his head was gone, completely severed by the force of the explosion, or by a piece of shrapnel that had sliced through his neck clean enough that searchers initially thought someone had taken a blade to him. They searched the immediate area and found his head several feet away from the body, recognizable despite the damage, undeniably Charlie's, and they carried both parts back to the surface, where his remains could be prepared for burial. The body went to the undertaker, what was left of it, while the head received whatever grim treatment was standard for such situations. And Charlie was laid to rest in Jerome's hillside cemetery, where hundreds of other miners had already been buried, and hundreds more would follow in the years to come. It should have ended there. Another mining death, another family left without a breadwinner, another name forgotten within a generation as Jerome's population churned through workers who came seeking fortune and left in coffins or fled when the work proved too dangerous or the pay too poor. But it didn't end, because less than a week after Charlie's funeral, the miners working his section of the tunnel started reporting something that made no sense, something that turned a tragic accident into something far stranger and more disturbing. The first reports were just sounds, heavy footsteps echoing through tunnels that should have been empty, the distinctive rhythm of mining boots on stone coming from passages where no work crews were scheduled. Miners heard the footsteps approaching and called out, thinking another crew had gotten turned around in the maze of shafts that all looked identical in the limited light of their headlamps, but received no answer. And when they went to investigate, they found the tunnels empty, no sign of whoever had been walking there just moments before. Then came the footprints, discovered by a crew arriving for their shift, perfectly formed boot prints in the dust and mud of the tunnel floor, a trail of them leading deep into the abandoned sections where nobody had any reason to go. The prints matched the boots Charlie had been wearing when he died. The distinctive pattern of wear on the sole was unmistakable to miners who'd worked alongside him for months or years, and the realization sent a chill through even the hardest men, the ones who'd seen enough death underground that they thought nothing could shake them anymore. Some claimed it was a prank, other miners trying to scare their crewmates, but the footprints kept appearing in sections of the mine that were sealed off or considered too dangerous to enter, places where no living person would risk going for any reason, let alone to play a practical joke that might get them fired or killed. Then the sightings began, and that's when Charlie stopped being a dead miner and became Headless Charlie, a presence that would haunt the United Verde tunnels for the next century. Miners working alone or in pairs in remote sections of the tunnels reported seeing a figure moving through the darkness just beyond the reach of their lights, a human shape that walked with purpose through passages that twisted and turned in ways that would confuse anyone who didn't know them intimately. When they called out or moved closer, trying to see who it was, the figure would vanish around a corner or simply disappear as if it had never been there at all, leaving behind nothing but that feeling of being watched that made the hair stand up on the back of your neck and your hands tighten on whatever tool you were holding. The few miners who got close enough to see clearly came back with stories that matched too perfectly to be coincidence or imagination. a headless body in mining clothes, moving through the tunnels as if searching for something, passing through areas that should have required crawling or climbing without any hesitation or difficulty, and disappearing into solid rock or empty air when pursued. Some claimed they could hear him breathing, a wet, raspy sound that came from a throat that shouldn't exist, while others reported the smell of burnt flesh and explosive residue that accompanied his appearances, the same smell that had filled the tunnel in the moments after the blast that killed him. Word spread through the mining community that Charlie was still down there, looking for his head, unable to rest or move on until he found what the explosion had taken from him, and miners started refusing to work certain sections where sightings were most frequent. The company officially dismissed the stories as superstition and threatened to fire anyone who let ghost tales interfere with production quotas. But even the supervisors and shift bosses started avoiding the deepest tunnels when they could, finding excuses to send other people into the sections where Headless Charlie walked. The legend grew with each passing year, fed by new sightings and experiences that kept the story alive even as the specific details of Charlie's death faded into uncertainty. By the time the mines closed in 1953, 3 generations of miners had worked those tunnels, and almost every one of them had a story about Headless Charlie, either first-hand experience or something that happened to a friend or crewmate. Sightings that continued right up until the day the company sealed the shafts and abandoned the mountain to silence. Today, those 88 miles of tunnels are closed to the public, too dangerous with cave-in risks and toxic gas pockets and structural decay that's had 70 years to turn passages into death traps. But locals insist that if you could go down there, if you could navigate the darkness and the dangers and find your way to the deepest sections where Charlie died, you'd still hear those footsteps echoing through the stone, still see that headless figure moving through the darkness, still feel the presence of a man who's been searching for over a century and refuses to stop until he finds what was taken from him in a split second of violence that should have ended his story, but instead condemned him to an eternity of wandering the very tunnels that killed him. Four miles from the Mexican border in the shadow of Montana Peak, the ghost town of Ruby sits exactly where lawlessness and desperation met during Arizona's mining boom, and what happened in that tiny settlement between 1920 and 1922 would spark the largest manhunt in southwestern history and leave behind a reputation for violence that still clings to the abandoned buildings like the dust that covers everything in the desert heat. Ruby was never a respectable town, not from the moment it was established in Bear Valley during the 1870s when silver was discovered and brought the first wave of miners, cattlemen, and the criminals who followed them both. The town became known as a haven for cattle rustlers who used the proximity to Mexico as their escape route, driving stolen livestock across the border where American law couldn't touch them, and the general atmosphere was one of constant tension, where men settled disputes with guns and nobody asked too many questions about your past or your business, as long as you didn't cause problems for the wrong people. By 1912, when Arizona achieved statehood and Ruby got its post office named after the postmaster's wife, the Montana mine had become the richest lead and zinc operation in the state, producing ore that made fortunes, while the town itself remained small and isolated, never growing beyond 1,200 residents at its absolute peak. Then came the Mexican Revolution in 1910, and everything that had been dangerous about Ruby's location became exponentially worse as bandits and rebels loyal to Pancho Villa began operating throughout the Mexican territory directly across from the Arizona border, turning the entire region into a war zone where raids and violence became so common that residents were officially instructed to remain heavily armed at all times, day and night, because you never knew when trouble would come riding up from the south. Philip Clark understood the danger better than most, which is why he kept a pistol or rifle in every single room of his house, and in the Ruby Mercantile store he'd purchased in 1914, the only general store in town and the economic heart of a community that depended on it for supplies, mail service, and the small sense of civilization it represented in an otherwise lawless corner of the territory. Clark built a new adobe structure to replace the original mercantile building, constructing it with thick walls that could potentially stop bullets and positioning it where he had clear sight lines to approaching riders. But even with all his precautions, the constant tension wore him down year after year until he finally decided in early 1920 that no amount of money was worth living in a place where you slept with weapons within arm's reach and taught your children to recognize the sound of gunfire before they learned their alphabet. When brothers Alexander and John Fraser approached him about buying the mercantile, Clark warned them explicitly about the dangers, told them about the raids and the bandits and the fact that Ruby's isolation made it an easy target, urged them to keep themselves armed at all times just as he had. But the Frasers were veterans of the Oro Blanco mines and figured they'd seen enough of Arizona's rough side to handle whatever Ruby could throw at them. The deal closed. In February 1920, Clark moved his family away to pursue cattle ranching with a clear conscience because he'd given fair warning, and the Fraser brothers moved into the back rooms of the mercantile where Clark had lived, settling into the routine of running a frontier general store in a town that was already dying, as the revolution across the border made mining operations increasingly dangerous and unprofitable. They lasted less than 2 months. On February 27, 1920, Alexander Fraser was working the front counter when shots exploded through the mercantile, the sound bringing John running from the back to find his brother on the floor bleeding, and 2 Mexican bandits rifling through the cash register with smoking pistols in their hands. The bandits forced John to open the safe at gunpoint, and he complied because what else could he do, watching them clean out whatever money Clark and the Fraser brothers had accumulated. And when they'd taken everything of value, they shot John Fraser in the eye and fled, leaving both brothers dying on the floor of the mercantile they'd owned for barely 8 weeks. A customer found them shortly after, Alexander already dead, and John barely clinging to consciousness. But he held on long enough to identify their attackers as Mexicans named Ezequiel Lara and Manuel Garcia before dying 3 days later in a Nogales hospital. Lara and Garcia disappeared across the Mexican border just 4 miles south, and there wasn't much American law could do about it except wait and hope they'd be stupid enough to come back. In October of that year, Garcia did exactly that, crossing back into Arizona where he was spotted by Pima County deputy sheriffs who confronted him, leading to a gunfight that ended with Garcia dead and the law having one less murderer to worry about. Mexican authorities caught up with Lara in 1921 and threw him in prison for a murder he committed on their side of the border. So justice of a sort was served. But the story should have ended there, with 2 killers accounted for, and the Fraser brothers avenged as much as frontier justice could manage. Except Clark was still feeling guilty about what happened to the Frasers, carrying the weight of having sold them a property that got them killed. So when Frank Pearson approached him about purchasing the mercantile in the aftermath of the murders, Clark warned him even more strongly than he'd warned the Frasers, laid out exactly what had happened and how dangerous the location was, and suggested that maybe Pearson should consider literally any other business opportunity in any other town. Pearson brushed the warnings aside, argued that the Fraser murders were a freak incident and that lightning didn't strike twice, that lawlessness was decreasing now that the revolution was winding down, and that another attack was statistically unlikely enough that the risk was worth taking. Clark reluctantly agreed to the sale. Pearson moved in with his wife Myrtle and their 4-year-old daughter Margaret, and they set about reopening the mercantile and trying to make it profitable in a town that by this point was virtually deserted except for the store itself, the post office, and the occasional miner still working claims in the surrounding hills. Their closest neighbor lived 8 miles away, which meant the Pearsons were essentially alone in Ruby, so they sent for family to help with the store and provide company. Myrtle's younger sister Elizabeth Purcell and Frank's sister Irene came to stay. And for just over a year, the arrangement worked. The mercantile serving the handful of remaining miners and the Pearson family building a life in the shadow of the Fraser murders. On the morning of August 26, 1921, Frank and Myrtle Pearson went for a horseback ride in the hills surrounding Ruby, leaving Margaret in the care of her aunts. And while they were out, they spotted 7 vaqueros riding hard toward town and got a bad feeling about it. The kind of instinct that keeps you alive on the frontier if you listen to it. So they turned their horses and raced back toward the mercantile. The 7 Mexican bandits were already inside by the time the Pearsons arrived, demanding tobacco from the shelves. And when Frank Pearson turned to get it, shots roared from behind him without warning or negotiation. Pearson grabbed his gun from under the counter and fired 3 wild shots at the bandits before a bullet dropped him dead on the floor in almost the exact same spot where Alexander Fraser had died 17 months earlier. The bandits shot Myrtle Pearson next, and then they knocked out her gold teeth with a rifle butt, taking them as trophies along with money from the safe that they forced open. 2 rifles, a revolver, clothing, tobacco, and groceries. Elizabeth Purcell was shot, but survived by throwing up her hand and deflecting the bullet, while Irene grabbed 4-year-old Margaret and ran for the bunkhouse, hiding while the bandits ransacked the store. Margaret fell during the escape and looked up to see one of the bandits standing over her, and for reasons nobody has ever explained, he turned and walked back inside instead of shooting her, a decision that spared her life and allowed her to grow up to become a teacher and reading specialist who retired in Tucson in 1980, carrying the memory of that moment for the rest of her life. The bandits fled back across the Mexican border, but this time they'd made mistakes, been recognized, left witnesses alive, and the territory had reached its limit for tolerance of cross-border violence. 2 of the 7 were identified as Placido Silvas and Manuel Martinez, and when authorities arrested them, they were tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang. They were being transported to Florence Prison when the sheriff's car overturned, killing the sheriff and injuring his deputy in an accident that gave Silvas and Martinez their chance to escape. The 2 fugitives filed off their handcuffs and killed 2 more law enforcement officers during their flight, bringing the total body count to 8 and triggering the largest manhunt in southwestern history up to that point. Over 700 volunteers joined the posse, and authorities used the first ever aerial search in Arizona law enforcement. Planes sweeping the desert looking for the fugitives. They were recaptured days later, dying of thirst in the desert, and Manuel Martinez was hanged by the state in 1923. But Placido Silvas, sentenced to life imprisonment, managed to escape from a work detail in 1928 and vanished completely. Never found, never heard from again, disappearing into legend as completely as Ruby itself would disappear when the mines finally played out. The Montana mine kept operating until 1944, when large-scale mining ceased, and the town died for real this time, residents tearing down buildings for materials and leaving Ruby to the desert and whatever ghosts decided to stay. Today, the ruins are preserved as part of the National Register of Historic Places, protected by a caretaker named Leslie Cherry, who lives alone in the ghost town and tells visitors she's more afraid of humans than ghosts, though she admits that with Ruby's bloody history, it would come as no surprise if the dead still walk the grounds. The adobe mercantile still stands where the Frasers and Pearsons were murdered, and locals insist you can feel something wrong there, a heaviness in the air around the building that shouldn't exist in the desert heat, and some claim to hear faint sounds coming from inside when nobody's there, as if the violence that soaked into those adobe walls 17 months apart in the exact same location created a psychic wound that never healed, a curse that turned a general store into a monument to senseless death, and made Ruby synonymous with the kind of frontier violence that history books sanitize, but the desert remembers forever. When Lottie and William Hutchinson purchased the building at 535 East Allen Street in Tombstone and opened the Birdcage Theater on December 26, 1881, they had dreams of bringing respectable family entertainment to Arizona's most notorious silver mining town, hosting variety shows and vaudeville acts that would draw the wealthy families and create the kind of cultural sophistication that San Francisco enjoyed. They even planned a ladies' night where Tombstone's respectable women could attend theatrical performances for free, an attempt to establish the Birdcage as a legitimate venue that would elevate the town's reputation beyond the lawlessness that had made it famous after the gunfight at the OK Corral earlier that year. But Tombstone in 1881 wasn't interested in respectability, and the miners who poured into town with silver dust in their pockets and violence in their blood wanted entertainment of a very different sort. So the Hutchinsons' dreams of family shows died quickly and were replaced by something the New York Times would later describe as the roughest, bawdiest, and most wicked night spot between Bassin Street and the Barbary Coast. The ladies' night was canceled permanently after exactly one attempt, and the Birdcage transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to the couple who'd purchased it with such high hopes. A 24-hour-a-day operation that combined a theater stage with a gambling hall, saloon, and brothel all under one roof, creating a perfect storm of alcohol, money, sex, and weapons that would make the building one of the most dangerous locations in the American West. The theater's layout reflected its transformation from respectable venue to den of vice in ways that were both ingenious and disturbing. The main hall featured a stage where performers still appeared, though the acts had shifted from family-friendly variety shows to cross-dressing comedy routines, burlesque performances, and exhibitions like Mademoiselle de Granville's Female Hercules act, where she picked up heavy objects with her teeth while wearing revealing costumes. Above the main floor, 14 balcony boxes lined both sides of the theater, each one curtained for privacy and rented out to the Birdcage's prostitutes, who used them as their workspaces, seeing clients while the shows continued below, and the gambling never stopped. The women would hang cradles in the gambling hall for their babies to sleep in while they worked, and those 14 cribs still hang there today, swaying slightly whenever anyone walks past them, even when there's no breeze to explain the movement. The basement was converted into a poker room that would become legendary for hosting the longest continuously running poker game in history, a marathon that started in 1881 and didn't end until 1889. 8 years, 5 months, and 3 days of non-stop gambling where approximately $10 million changed hands and 10% went directly to the house. Players would come and go, sleeping in shifts while others took their seats. The game perpetually active with fresh decks and fresh money, and tempers running high as fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card in a smoke-filled basement where disputes were settled with bullets more often than words. The violence at the Birdcage wasn't occasional or exceptional. It was constant and expected, woven into the daily operations of a place where armed men drank heavily, gambled aggressively, and competed for the attention of women whose survival depended on keeping dangerous customers satisfied. 140 bullet holes still riddle the walls and ceiling of the building, each one representing a moment when someone drew a weapon and fired, whether in anger or celebration or simple drunken recklessness. And those holes have never been repaired because they have become part of the attraction. Physical evidence of just how wild the Birdcage really was during its operational years. 26 people died within the building during the years it operated, killed in shootouts over poker hands, stabbed in fights over prostitutes, shot in the back over perceived insults, or driven to suicide by the desperation that came with losing everything in a place designed to take your money and your dignity in equal measure. The most infamous of those deaths was the murder of Margarita, a prostitute known as the Painted Lady, who made the fatal mistake of attracting the affections of Billy Milgreen, a high-stakes gambler who'd been involved with another birdcage prostitute named Gold Dollar. When Gold Dollar discovered that Billy's interest had shifted to Margarita, jealousy consumed her completely, and she confronted her rival with a double-edged stiletto knife, stabbing Margarita repeatedly in the chest with such force that witnesses said she was trying to carve the woman's heart out of her body. Margarita died on the floor of the birdcage while the shows continued on stage, and the gambling continued in the basement because nothing stopped operations at Tombstone's most profitable vice den, not even murder. The murder weapon disappeared after Gold Dollar's arrest, vanishing into Tombstone's criminal underworld, and wouldn't be found again until a century later when renovations uncovered the stiletto hidden in a wall cavity where someone had concealed it to protect Gold Dollar, or perhaps to keep it as a trophy of the most notorious killing the birdcage had witnessed. By then, the birdcage had long since closed its doors, shuttering operations in 1892, when Tombstone's silver mines flooded, and the economic boom that sustained the town's wildest excesses came to an abrupt end. The building sat abandoned for decades, used briefly as a coffee shop in the 1930s, but otherwise left to decay, its bullet-riddled walls and blood-stained floors preserved by neglect and the dry Arizona climate that prevented the kind of rot that would have destroyed a similar structure in a wetter region. When new owners reopened the birdcage as a museum and tourist attraction in the latter half of the 20th century, they discovered that the building's violent past hadn't been left behind with the closing of the mines, that something had remained in those rooms where 26 people had died and hundreds more had lost their dignity or their fortunes or both. The paranormal activity at the Birdcage Theater is so frequent and so well documented that it's become one of the most investigated locations in paranormal research, featured on Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, Ghost Lab, and Fact or Faked, Paranormal Files, with investigators consistently recording evidence of activity that defies conventional explanation. Staff members and visitors report the overwhelming smell of cigar smoke in a building where smoking has been prohibited for decades. The scent so strong and sudden that people turn expecting to see someone lighting up only to find empty air. The smell of whiskey appears without source, as if invisible patrons are still drinking at the bar that hasn't served alcohol since the 1890s. And sometimes both scents manifest simultaneously, along with phantom sounds of dice rolling, cards shuffling, and poker chips clicking together in the basement where the longest game in history was played. Music plays from the stage when no one is there, not recordings or modern sounds, but the tinny notes of period pianos and the kind of bawdy songs that would have accompanied the burlesque shows, and visitors hear disembodied laughter echoing through the main hall as if the crowds that pack the birdcage every night are still enjoying the entertainment. The most frequent apparition is the woman in white, a figure in a proper Victorian dress and bonnet who appears on the stairwell and walks through the poker room as if she's searching for something, moving without acknowledging the presence of living witnesses who report that she seems unaware they exist. The bonnet suggests she was a respectable woman, which makes her presence in the birdcage inexplicable because no respectable woman would have been caught dead in Tombstone's most notorious brothel, leading to theories that she came in with a hearse to retrieve a body and somehow became trapped in the building's spiritual energy, condemned to search forever for whoever she came to collect. Other spirits are less passive and considerably more aggressive, particularly whatever entity attacked William Hunley during a seance conducted in the 1980s when he owned the property and hired a psychic medium to investigate the paranormal claims. During the session, something manifested with enough physical force to wrap invisible hands around Hunley's throat and strangle him while witnesses watched in horror, the attack continuing until the medium was forcibly broken from her trance and the seance ended abruptly. Hunley's neck was bruised for 6 weeks afterward, physical evidence that something in the birdcage was capable of violence even in death, Perhaps one of the gunfighters who died there, or a gambler who lost everything and blamed the house for his ruin. An antique poker chip from the building's gambling days would appear and disappear with such frequency that Hunley's son, Bill, started locking it in a bank vault. But even that couldn't contain it, and the chip would vanish whenever antiquarians came to authenticate it, only reappearing after they'd left, leading to speculation that it belonged to someone who didn't want it handled by strangers, possibly Doc Holliday himself, who'd been known to frequent the birdcage. Employees report apparitions in period clothing throughout the building, including a man in black and white striped pants who walks across the stage holding a clipboard as if he's still working as a stagehand, managing performances that ended over a century ago, and shadow figures that move through the balcony boxes where the prostitutes once worked, shapes that suggest people but lack any solid form. The Great Hall is considered the most active area, where the heaviest concentration of deaths occurred, and where the energy of thousands of nights of drinking, gambling, sex, and violence seems to have imprinted itself on the physical space in ways that create residual hauntings that play out like recordings. But other areas show signs of intelligent haunting, spirits that interact with the living and respond to questions during investigations, suggesting that at least some of the birdcage's dead are aware they've died and are trapped in the building for reasons they either can't or won't explain. Bill Clanton, an employee and descendant of the gunfighter who shares his name, tells visitors that spirits are always moving around in there, and that unexplained laughter and carrying on is just part of working at the birdcage, along with the smell of smoke around the dice table that appears without warning and dissipates just as quickly. His approach is pragmatic, telling the spirits to leave him alone and he'll leave them alone, an accommodation that seems to work for someone who spends his days surrounded by the ghosts of gamblers, prostitutes, and gunfighters who made the birdcage their world in life and apparently refuse to leave it in death. Today, the theater offers ghost tours that take visitors through the building after dark, and paranormal activity during these tours is so common that guides have stopped being surprised when equipment malfunctions, temperatures drop without explanation, or visitors report being touched by invisible hands in the basement or on the stairs. The Birdcage Theater stands as a monument to Tombstone's wildest years, preserved exactly as it was when the last poker game ended, and the last prostitute left, and the violence finally stopped. Except it didn't really stop because the 140 bullet holes in the walls and the 26 souls who died there have ensured that the Birdcage Theater remains as wild and wicked in death as it was in life, a place where the past refuses to stay buried, and every night brings fresh evidence that some forms of entertainment never really end. The Apache called them the Devil's Playground, and the Superstition Mountains earned that name through centuries of deaths that seemed too frequent and too strange to be mere coincidence, as if the jagged peaks rising from the Arizona desert were actively hostile to human presence. The Apache believed the mountains contained a literal portal to hell, guarded by a thunder god who would choose the fate of anyone foolish enough to trespass on sacred ground. And when European settlers ignored those warnings and came searching for gold in the 1890s, the death toll that followed seemed to confirm that something in those mountains wanted people dead. Goldfields sprang up almost overnight in 1893, when prospectors discovered gold ore in the shadow of those cursed peaks, and within months, a full town materialized where there had been nothing but sagebrush and scorpions, complete with 3 saloons, a boarding house, a general store, a brewery, a butcher shop, a schoolhouse, and a blacksmith that served the 1,500 miners who poured into the area, convinced they were about to strike it rich. The post office opened on October 7, 1893, making Goldfield official in the eyes of the territorial government, and for 5 glorious years the town boomed as gold flowed from the mines and money changed hands in the saloons where miners drank away their wages and dreamed of finding something bigger, something that would make them wealthy beyond imagination. That dream had a name that every prospector knew: the Lost Dutchman's Gold Mine, a legendary mother lode supposedly hidden somewhere in the superstitions by Jacob Waltz, a German immigrant who discovered it decades earlier and kept its location secret until his death in 1891, just 2 years before Goldfield's founding. Waltz's deathbed confession to Julia Thomas, the neighbor who'd cared for him in his final illness, described the mine's location in terms vague enough to send thousands of treasure hunters into the superstitions over the next century. And at least 8 people have died searching for it, their bodies found in various states of decomposition in ravines and caves throughout the mountains, some from exposure or dehydration, but others from causes that were never adequately explained. The legend fueled Goldfield's growth beyond what the actual mines could support, drawing prospectors who used the town as a base camp while they searched the surrounding peaks for Waltz's lost fortune. And the combination of legitimate mining operations and treasure hunting madness created a population that swelled to 4,000 at its peak, far more than the small settlement could reasonably support. But the gold that built Goldfield was low grade from the start, and within 5 years, the ore quality dropped so dramatically that mining became unprofitable, and the exodus began as quickly as the rush had started. The post office closed on November 2, 1898, officially marking Goldfield as abandoned. And by 1900, the town that had hosted thousands just years earlier was empty, except for a handful of stubborn prospectors who refused to accept that the gold was gone and kept digging in increasingly desperate attempts to find something, anything, that would justify staying in a place the Apache had warned them to avoid. Then, in 1897, just as Goldfield was beginning its death spiral, miners working the deepest shafts broke through into something they hadn't anticipated: an underground aquifer so massive that locals would later call it the biggest lake in Arizona. And the water that came flooding up from below filled the mine tunnels completely, drowning the underground operations and making further extraction impossible. The timing couldn't have been worse, arriving just as the ore quality was declining and sealing Goldfield's fate, as surely as if the mountains themselves had decided the town had overstayed its welcome. Some dismissed the aquifer as bad luck or poor geological survey work, but others remembered the Apache legends about the thunder god who punished trespassers, and wondered if the flooding was exactly what it looked like: a curse manifesting as natural disaster, the mountains reclaiming what miners had tried to steal. The town died quickly after that. Buildings abandoned mid-operation with tools still on workbenches and bottles still on bar shelves, as if residents had simply walked away one day and never looked back, and Goldfield joined the dozens of other ghost towns scattered across Arizona's mining country. Another boom and bust story that would have been forgotten entirely if not for what started happening after everyone left. The paranormal activity at Goldfield wasn't documented immediately because there was nobody left to document it. But as the 20th century progressed and curiosity seekers started visiting abandoned ghost towns for entertainment, Goldfield developed a reputation among locals as a place where you didn't want to be after dark. The first consistent reports came from the saloon, a building that still stands in relatively good condition considering it's been abandoned for over a century, where visitors began hearing what they described as mournful voices echoing from empty rooms. The voices aren't words exactly, more like the sound of men talking at a distance, the low rumble of conversation that stops the moment you try to get close enough to make out what's being said. And some witnesses report hearing laughter mixed in with the voices, the kind of rough, alcohol-soaked laughter that would have filled the saloon during Goldfield's operational years, but makes no sense coming from a building that hasn't served drinks since 1898. Apparitions appear behind the bar, translucent figures that move as if they're still serving customers, reaching for bottles that aren't there anymore, and pouring drinks into glasses that exist only in whatever reality the spirits are inhabiting. The figures are male without exception, dressed in period mining clothes with faces that witnesses struggle to describe afterward, not because they're frightening, but because they're oddly indistinct, as if the spirits themselves are losing definition over time, fading slowly into the same obscurity that claimed the town itself. The bordello is even more active than the saloon, though the activity there is less benign and considerably more threatening. A mysterious figure in a cowboy hat has been reported by multiple witnesses, always in the same location, always making sounds that have no source, and creating an atmosphere of dread so intense that people have fled the building in panic without being able to articulate what exactly frightened them. The figure doesn't speak or move toward witnesses, but its presence carries a weight of menace that suggests violence held barely in check, and some paranormal researchers theorize it might be the spirit of a miner who died violently in that location, perhaps in a fight over one of the prostitutes who worked there, or in a robbery gone wrong during the chaos of Goldfield's final days. Objects move in the bordello without explanation. Doors that were closed are found open, and the temperature drops suddenly in specific rooms for no reason that conventional science can explain. Cold spots appearing in the Arizona heat that feel like stepping into a walk-in freezer. Fear, Frontier, a paranormal investigation company that conducts tours of Goldfield after dark, has documented extensive activity throughout the town, but particularly in the mine shafts that extend beneath the surface, the same tunnels that flooded in 1897 and ended the town's mining operations. Tour guide Matt Mason warns visitors that the underground is where most people feel tampered with, touched, or grabbed by invisible presences, and it's where he's seen the most people run in terror from something they can't see but can feel with absolute certainty. The mine itself is where the curse theory gains its strongest support, because the activity down there goes beyond residual haunting or individual spirits and feels like something larger and more malevolent, an intelligence that resents intrusion and makes its displeasure known through physical contact and psychological pressure that builds until people can't stand to remain underground another second. Mason describes participants being touched in the darkness, feeling hands on their shoulders or backs when nobody's standing near them, and experiencing the overwhelming sensation of being watched by something hostile that exists just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Some report hearing footsteps approaching through flooded sections of the mine where walking should be impossible, the splash of boots in water growing closer until panic drives them back toward the surface, and others describe voices coming from the deepest shafts calling for help in languages they don't recognize or can't quite hear clearly enough to identify. The Travel, Channel's Ghost Adventures, investigated Goldfield in 2015 and documented multiple instances of unexplained phenomena, their equipment registering electromagnetic fluctuations and temperature changes that corresponded with crew members reporting feeling touched or experiencing sudden overwhelming fear. The investigation concluded that Goldfield qualified as genuinely haunted rather than simply atmospheric, a distinction the show rarely makes given their tendency to find activity at every location they investigate. The Superstition Mountains themselves contribute to Goldfield's haunted reputation in ways that extend beyond the town's borders, because the Lost Dutchman legend continues to lure treasure hunters into the peaks where 8 confirmed deaths have occurred and an unknown number of people have vanished without trace. Some of those bodies were found with wounds that suggested violence, murdered by fellow prospectors over claim disputes, or because they'd gotten too close to finding something valuable, while others showed signs of dying from exposure in circumstances that didn't quite make sense. Experienced hikers found dead from dehydration within walking distance of water sources, or from hypothermia on nights that weren't particularly cold. The Apache warnings about the thunder god choosing fates seem prophetic, when you look at the pattern of deaths in the superstitions. Deaths that cluster around certain areas and seem to target people who were actively searching for gold rather than casual hikers or tourists, as if the mountains really are protected by something that punishes greed specifically. Goldfield sits at the base of those mountains, like a memorial to everyone who ignored the warnings and paid for it. A town that existed for 5 years and has been dead for over a century, but refuses to stay quiet. Where the voices in the saloon never stop talking, and the figure in the bordello never leaves his post, and something in the flooded mine shafts continues to touch visitors who venture too deep into the darkness. Matt Mason tells people that Goldfield is probably the most haunted place in Arizona, that you walk on cursed ground the moment you enter the town limits, and the curse goes even deeper when you descend into the mines, where it was supposedly struck in 1897. Whether you believe in curses or not, the numbers don't lie. A town that lasted 5 years has been haunted for over 120. The paranormal activity shows no signs of diminishing, and the Superstition Mountains continue to kill people who enter them searching for gold that may or may not exist, defending their secrets with the same enthusiasm they showed when the Apache controlled the territory and warned everyone to stay away from the Devil's Playground, where the Thunder God chooses your fate, and death comes more easily than fortune ever did. Henry Wickenburg wasn't looking for anything except water when he spotted the quartz outcropping in 1863, a rock formation rising from the desert floor about 12 miles south of what would eventually become the town bearing his name. But when he examined that quartz more closely and saw the gold veining through it like frozen lightning, he realized he'd stumbled onto something that would change his life forever, though not in the way he imagined. The California gold rush had already passed him by, leaving Wickenburg in his 40s without the fortune he'd gone west to find. But Arizona territory in 1863 was still wild enough that a man could stake a claim and work it without competition if he got there first. So Wickenburg hammered his markers into the ground and named his find after the turkey vultures that circled overhead in the relentless desert heat, birds that would come to seem prophetic given the death toll the vulture mine would eventually produce. At first, Wickenburg worked the mine alone, extracting gold-rich ore and hauling it to assay offices himself, but he quickly realized the physical labor was more than one man could handle, so he made a decision that would define the mine's operations for the next 80 years. He allowed other miners to work his claim for a flat fee of $15 per ton of ore extracted, keeping ownership while outsourcing the brutal work of digging gold from Arizona's unforgiving rock. The arrangement drew miners from across the territory, and within months, a settlement had grown around the Vulture Mine, a collection of wooden structures and canvas tents that would eventually solidify into Vulture City, complete with homes, saloons, a post office, boarding houses, a school, a brothel, and an assay office where extracted ore was tested for purity and stored before shipment. At its peak, Vulture City hosted an estimated 5,000 residents, making it one of Arizona's larger settlements during the territorial period, and the mine itself became the most productive gold operation in the state, eventually yielding over $200 million worth of gold and silver by modern valuations. But that productivity came with a problem that would define Vulture City's dark reputation: theft on a scale that made the mine's legitimate operations seem almost secondary to the criminal enterprise that flourished within it. High grading, the practice of miners stealing ore for themselves instead of turning it over to the mine owners, was so common at Vulture that some estimates suggest up to half of all ore extracted from the mine disappeared into miners' pockets before it could be officially weighed and recorded. The theft wasn't limited to small-time operators pocketing nuggets. Organized operations smuggled out bags of gold-rich ore hidden in lunch pails, toolboxes, and even hollowed-out boot heels, selling it to fences in Wickenburg or Phoenix, who asked no questions as long as the gold was genuine. The assay office, where processed gold was stored before shipment, became a particular target, burglarized so frequently that thousands of dollars in gold vanished over the years, despite armed guards and reinforced doors. Bandits attacked bullion shipments leaving Vulture City, leading to shootouts on the desert trails that connected the mine to civilization, and the underground storage vault beneath the assay building became the scene of multiple gunfights as thieves attempted to break into what was essentially a giant safe holding fortunes in gold and silver bars. Eventually, the situation became so dangerous that military troops were brought in to protect the gold, but corruption infected even them, with soldiers meant to guard the bullion sometimes facilitating its theft or stealing it themselves. Vulture City never had an official lawman, no sheriff or marshal to enforce territorial law, which meant justice was handled vigilante style by miners and mine supervisors, who took theft personally and dealt with it according to frontier standards that valued property over human life. The punishment for high grading was death, a sentence carried out by hanging, and the tree chosen for these executions stood just outside Henry Wickenburg's home, an ironwood tree with branches thick enough to support a man's weight, and positioned where everyone in town could see what happened to thieves who got caught. The hangings weren't the quick neck-breaking drops that professional executioners used. These were slow strangulation killings, where the condemned man was hauled up just high enough that his toes couldn't quite touch the ground, leaving him to thrash and choke for minutes or even hours while the town watched, and the message was delivered with brutal clarity: steal from the Vulture mine and die slowly under the Arizona sun. 18 men were hanged from the tree between the 1860s and 1900, their bodies left to swing in the heat until they stopped moving, and some accounts claim the corpses were left hanging longer still, rotting in plain view as a deterrent to anyone else considering theft, because men executed for high grading weren't considered respectable enough to be buried in the town cemetery with decent folks. Instead, their bodies were allegedly cut down and either buried in unmarked graves near the tree itself or dragged out into the open desert and left for the vultures that gave the mine its name, creating a symmetry that must have seemed darkly appropriate to the men who carried out these frontier executions. No formal records exist documenting these hangings, which has led some historians to question whether all 18 actually occurred, or if the number grew in the telling as Vulture City's reputation transformed from mining town to ghost town legend. But the tree itself still stands, gnarled and ancient, its branches reaching toward the sky in the same shape they held when ropes were thrown over them, and men's lives ended in gasping, struggles for air they couldn't quite reach. And regardless of the exact historical truth, something about that tree and the ground around it feels wrong to visitors in ways that go beyond atmosphere or suggestion, a heaviness that presses down on people who approach it, and a sense of watching that comes from no visible source. The paranormal activity at Vulture City is extensive and well documented. Investigated by Ghost Adventures in a 2010 episode that declared the location genuinely haunted after documenting multiple instances of unexplained phenomena. The hanging tree is the epicenter of that activity, surrounded by reports of shadowy figures appearing near the trunk at dusk and after dark, forms that suggest human shapes but lack definition or solidity, moving through the area as if patrolling or guarding something that only they can see. Some witnesses describe these shadows as aggressive, moving toward observers rather than away, creating an atmosphere of threat that sends people backing away from the tree, even though nothing has actually touched them. Just the overwhelming feeling that they're not welcome and something is about to happen if they don't leave immediately. The most disturbing paranormal claim involves the ghosts of the hanged men protecting the gold they died trying to steal, as if execution and frontier justice weren't punishment enough to end their obsession with the ore they spent their lives digging from the earth. Witnesses report seeing apparitions near the tree and throughout the mine area, figures in period mining clothes who appear to be watching the remaining gold deposits or standing guard over sections of the old workings where valuable ore might still be hidden. The implication is terrifying, that these men died slowly and painfully, were denied proper burial, and have spent over a century still fixated on the gold that got them killed, unable to rest or move on because greed followed them past death and trapped them in an eternal loop of protection and paranoia. Tour guides who work at Vulture City report regular paranormal experiences throughout the property, but particularly around the hanging tree and Henry Wickenburg's adjacent cabin, where the founder lived during his ownership of the mine and from where he would have been able to watch the executions take place just outside his door. The cabin itself is considered among the most haunted structures on the property, with visitors reporting sudden temperature drops, the sensation of being touched by invisible hands, and overwhelming feelings of sadness or anger that seem to emanate from the building's interior. Beyond the hanging tree, Vulture City's other structures harbor their own spirits and their own stories of violence and tragedy. Jimmy Davis haunts the mine shafts where he died in one of the most horrific accidents in the mine's history, getting his arm caught in machinery that then flung him repeatedly into heavy equipment, breaking every bone in his body before dropping him down a vertical shaft that plunged dozens of feet into darkness. His ghost is heard crying for help in the middle of the night, his voice echoing from the mines in desperate pleas that no living person can answer because Jimmy Davis died over a century ago and his cries are just recordings of agony that replay endlessly in the tunnels where he suffered. The assay building, where gold was processed and stored, and where multiple shootouts occurred as bandits tried to rob the precious bullion, has its own concentration of paranormal activity, with apparitions appearing in period dress and the sounds of gunfire echoing through rooms that haven't seen violence in over 100 years. The brothel and saloon report is the standard ghost town phenomena: disembodied voices, objects moving without explanation, doors opening and closing on their own, the usual catalog of activity that suggests residual energy or spirits trapped in the locations where they spent their living hours. But it's the hanging tree that dominates Vulture City's haunted reputation. That ironwood tree standing alone with Henry Wickenburg's cabin beside it, branches empty now but forever marked by the 18 men who died there slowly, left to rot as warnings, denied burial with decent people, and apparently unable or unwilling to leave the location where frontier justice took their lives for the crime of stealing gold from a mine that was stealing their labor, their health, and ultimately their souls, in exchange for $15 per ton of ore that made other men millionaires while they died poor and desperate and willing to risk hanging for one more chance at the fortune that Arizona kept promising but never delivered. Henry Wickenburg himself never profited from the mine the way he should have, selling his 80% interest in 1866 for $85,000 to investors who then swindled him out of most of that money by claiming he didn't have clear title to his own discovery. He spent years suing them, burning through every penny trying to reclaim what was rightfully his, and on May 14, 1905, sick and destitute and broken by the knowledge that his discovery had enriched everyone except himself, Henry Wickenburg put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. The Vulture mine continued operating until 1942, when government regulations shut down all non-essential gold mining to focus resources on World War II. And though the mine appealed and briefly reopened, it never regained its former vigor and eventually closed permanently, leaving Vulture City to the desert and the ghosts. Today, the ghost town has been carefully restored and operates as a tourist attraction, offering guided and self-guided tours through over 16 original buildings from the 1800s, and visitors can stand beneath the hanging tree and decide for themselves whether the shadows they see are tricks of desert light or something that's been waiting there since the last man was cut down and dragged away, whether the feeling of being watched comes from paranoia or from the spirits of 18 hanged men who never left the place where frontier justice took everything from them and gave nothing in return except a rope, a branch, and the kind of death that follows you beyond the grave. The San Pedro River carved through Arizona territory like a lifeline in the 1870s, bringing water to a landscape that desperately needed it. And when silver was discovered in Tombstone in 1877, the problem wasn't finding ore, but processing it, because the mining operations required massive quantities of water that simply didn't exist in the hills where the silver veins ran thick and deep. The solution was Millville, established on the banks of the San Pedro in the late 1870s specifically to house the stamp mills that would crush Tombstone silver ore into processable material, using the river water to power the massive mechanical stamps that pounded rock into powder day and night without stopping. 2 enormous mills were constructed by the Tombstone Milling and Mining Company, the Corbin Mill and the Gird Mill, industrial complexes built from stone and adobe with walls thick enough to contain the deafening roar of the stamps that dropped with rhythmic precision, crushing thousands of tons of ore into silver-bearing concentrate that would make fortunes for mine owners in Tombstone, while the mill workers themselves earned subsistence wages for labor that destroyed their hearing and their bodies over the course of brutal 12-hour shifts. Across the river, literally within pistol shot of the mills, Charleston sprang up as the residential town where mill workers and their families lived, along with the support businesses that served them: stores, saloons, hotels, livery stables, a church, a school, restaurants, and a post office that made Charleston official in the eyes of territorial authorities, who recognized it as a legitimate settlement despite its rough reputation. At its peak, Charleston boasted over 400 residents and more than 40 buildings, with merchandise stores stocking inventory valued between $50,000 and $100,000, suggesting a thriving commercial center that served not just mill workers, but also the lucrative trade with Sonora, Mexico, just across the southern border. Eastern newspapers described Charleston as boisterous and violent, a shoot-'em-up town where gun smoke drifted over the land and outlaws controlled the streets. And there was some truth to those characterizations because Charleston became a haven for some of the most infamous criminals in Arizona territory. Frank Stilwell, a notorious outlaw who would eventually be murdered by Wyatt Earp's vendetta posse, owned a saloon in Charleston before selling it to Jacob Swart in 1881. The Clanton Ranch, run by Old Man Clanton and his sons John, Finn, Ike, and Billy, sat just 5 miles south of town, and the ranch employed or associated with nearly every major outlaw operating in southern Arizona at the time: Johnny Ringo, Curly Bill Brocious, Pete Spence, and Frank and Tom McClory, all men whose names would become synonymous with the violence that culminated in the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone on October 26, 1881. But despite its reputation and its infamous residents, Charleston accomplished something remarkable that no other Arizona mining town could claim. It never lost a single shipment of silver or money to bandits, not once during its entire operational life. The only attempted robbery occurred in Millville on March 25, 1882, when bandits tried to steal from the Tombstone Mining Company and murdered mining engineer M.R. Peel in the process, but they failed to take any silver, and justice came swiftly for the perpetrators who'd made the fatal mistake of thinking Millville's mill workers would be easy targets. The truth was that Charleston and Millville were tougher than their reputation suggested, not because of outlaws, but because of the ordinary men who worked the mills and lived in conditions that would break softer people. The stamp mills ran continuously, 24 hours a day without pause, creating an industrial hellscape of noise and danger where workers operated massive machinery. that could crush a human body as easily as it crushed rock. The stamps themselves weighed hundreds of pounds each and dropped repeatedly onto ore with enough force to pulverize stone, and the machinery that lifted and dropped them operated without safety guards or emergency shutoffs, meaning any mistake or moment of inattention could result in a worker being pulled into the mechanisms and destroyed in seconds. The noise was so intense that mill workers went deaf within years, losing their hearing to the constant pounding that never stopped, even at night, when they tried to sleep in Charleston with the sound carrying across the river and reverberating through every building in town. The work was filthy, covering men in rock dust and chemical residue from the amalgamation process that separated silver from crushed ore, using mercury and other toxic substances that workers handled without protection or understanding of the long-term health consequences. Industrial accidents were common and often fatal, with workers crushed by stamps, caught in belt drives, or falling from elevated platforms into machinery that mangled them beyond recognition, and there were no compensation laws or safety regulations to protect them or their families when tragedy struck. Between April 1881 and April 1882, the Millville Mills produced over $1 million in processed silver bullion, a staggering amount that represented thousands of tons of ore crushed by stamps operated by men whose names aren't recorded in any historical document because they were considered as disposable as the rock they processed. The mills made fortunes for investors in San Francisco and back east, while the workers died slowly from industrial diseases or quickly in accidents that warranted no more than a brief mention in territorial newspapers, if they were mentioned at all. The Tombstone Epitaph published a piece on May 6, 1882, describing Charleston as well-regulated and free from turmoil, and one of the most peaceful places we were ever in, which either represented an attempt to rehabilitate the town's reputation for investment purposes or suggested that Charleston's outlaw element had declined significantly after the events surrounding the OK Corral gunfight had scattered or killed most of the major criminals who'd called it home. But peaceful or not, Charleston's fate was tied completely to the mills across the river, and when Tombstone's silver mines flooded in 1886, filling the underground workings with water that couldn't be pumped out fast enough to maintain operations, the mills were forced to shut down because there was no ore left to process. The towns went into steep decline immediately, but they might have survived in diminished form if not for what happened on May 3, 1887, when the Sonoran earthquake struck southern Arizona territory with enough force to devastate everything within a 100-mile radius. The quake itself was catastrophic, but what made it truly destructive was the duration of the aftershocks, which continued for over 30 minutes, waves of seismic activity that pounded the region repeatedly and brought down structures that had survived the initial shock. Charleston's adobe buildings, already weakened by abandonment and lack of maintenance, couldn't withstand the sustained shaking, and when the earthquake finally stopped, virtually every structure in town had collapsed into rubble, leaving Charleston and Millville uninhabitable even for the few residents who'd stuck around after the mills closed. The Charleston post office shut down on October 24, 1888, and by 1889, barely a decade after their founding, both towns were completely abandoned, ghost towns left to the elements and to the scavengers who came later to tear down what remained of the buildings for firewood and salvage materials. A Mexican population living in tents occupied the ruins briefly, dismantling sidewalks, awnings, roofs, doors, and partitions to burn during cold desert nights, accelerating the destruction that the earthquake had started. Today, the ruins of Millville consist primarily of the massive stone foundations and walls of the stamp mills, structures built so solidly from rock that even the earthquake couldn't completely destroy them, and they stand like monuments to industrial power and human suffering, walls thick enough to absorb years of pounding from stamps that processed millions of dollars in silver, while the men who operated them earned barely enough to survive. Charleston across the river has almost nothing left, just scattered adobe foundations and the cemetery on the hillside, where mill workers and their families were buried, graves marked with wooden crosses that have long since rotted away, or simple stones that bear no names because the dead they mark were too poor to afford proper headstones. The sites are accessible only by hiking up the San Pedro River, a 2.5-mile trek through riparian habitat that's been designated as the San Pedro Riparian National Conservation Area and managed by the Bureau of Land Management, which means Charleston and Millville remain isolated and rarely visited. Ghost towns in the truest sense because almost nobody goes there anymore. But those who do make the hike report experiences that suggest the mill's workers never really left, that something of their suffering and their anger at industrial conditions that killed them without compensation or recognition has imprinted itself on the ruins in ways that manifest as paranormal activity decades after the last stamp fell and the last worker fled the earthquake's destruction. The most common phenomenon is the sound of machinery, the rhythmic pounding of stamps operating at full capacity, heard by hikers who reach the Millville ruins and stand among the stone walls listening to phantom industrial noise that comes from no visible source. The sound starts as a distant rumble and builds to the deafening roar that mill workers endured 12 hours a day, the stamps dropping with mechanical precision to crush ore that hasn't existed there since 1886, and witnesses describe the experience as overwhelming, not just hearing the sounds, but feeling them vibrate through the ground and through their bodies the same way workers would have felt them constantly during Millville's operational years. The sound stops suddenly rather than fading, cutting off as if someone threw a switch and shut down operations, leaving silence that feels heavy and wrong after the noise. Other visitors report seeing shadowy figures moving through the ruins, human shapes that appear to be working, bending and lifting and moving with the purposeful motion of laborers performing industrial tasks. But the figures lack definition and vanish when approached or called out to, as if they're projections from the past that can't acknowledge the present. The feeling of being watched is constant throughout the ruins, an awareness of unseen eyes tracking visitors' movements through spaces where dozens of men died in accidents or from industrial diseases, and some hikers report an overwhelming sense of sadness and anger emanating from the stone walls themselves. Emotions so strong they manifest as physical sensations of chest tightness and difficulty breathing that have no medical cause. Charleston Cemetery is even more active than the mill ruins, with reports of apparitions moving among the graves at dusk and after dark, figures that appear to be tending to burial sites that have been neglected for over a century, and phantom voices calling out names that were common in the 1880s but mean nothing to modern visitors who hear them. The earthquake that destroyed Charleston killed people in the collapse of adobe buildings, crushing families as they slept or tried to flee the sustained shaking that wouldn't stop. And local paranormal researchers believe some of those deaths created the kind of traumatic energy that generates intelligent hauntings, where spirits are aware they're dead but remain tied to the location where they died suddenly and violently. The combination of industrial deaths at the mills and earthquake deaths in Charleston has created a haunted complex where multiple types of paranormal activity overlap. Residual hauntings playing out like recordings mixed with intelligent spirits that interact with visitors and respond to questions or presence with phenomena that suggest awareness and intent. What happened at Charleston and Millville was working-class tragedy on a scale that Arizona's more famous ghost towns never quite matched. Hundreds of men destroying their bodies to enrich distant investors, dying in accidents that were considered acceptable costs of doing business, and then having their homes literally collapse on them when the earth itself shook for 30 minutes straight. And maybe it's no surprise that kind of suffering and violence would leave something behind. Echoes of industrial noise and glimpses of workers who refused to stop laboring even though the mills shut down in 1886 and the towns died in 1889. And nothing remains but stone walls and scattered graves in a conservation area that most people will never visit, which means Charleston and Millville stay haunted in isolation. Ghost towns in every sense, where the dead outnumber the living and the past continues to make itself heard through phantom stamp mills that process silver ore that exists only in whatever reality the spirits still inhabit. The Apache had been mining turquoise from the slopes of the Dragoon Mountains for centuries before white settlers arrived, trading the blue-green stone with Navajo tribes and creating a network of shallow tunnels that stretched along what would later be called Turquoise Ridge. When Tiffany and Company created a fashion craze for polished turquoise in the 1880s, prospectors reopened those ancient Apache mines and established a settlement called Turquoise, Arizona Territory, hoping to capitalize on the demand from wealthy East Coast buyers who wanted jewelry made from the distinctive greenish-tinted stone that came from New Mexico and Arizona rather than the bluer turquoise mined in Persia. The post office opened on October 22, 1890, making turquoise an official town, but the fashion trend proved as fickle as most fashion trends do. And by September 17, 1894, demand had collapsed so completely that the post office closed and the town was abandoned, another failed mining venture in a territory full of them. The story should have ended there, with turquoise joining the dozens of other Arizona settlements that boomed briefly and died quickly, leaving nothing but ruins and graves. But the prospectors who'd been digging for turquoise had noticed something else in those tunnels. Copper veining through the rock in concentrations that suggested significant deposits lay deeper underground if someone was willing to invest the time and money to extract it. John Gleason was willing, and in 1896 he registered a copper claim just downhill from the abandoned turquoise mines, opening what he called the Copper Bell Mine and creating a new town that bore his own name rather than the gemstone that had attracted the first wave of settlers. The timing was perfect because copper demand was exploding as America electrified and industrialized, creating a market that wouldn't collapse the way turquoise fashion had. And within a few years, the Copper Bell was producing ore in quantities that attracted other mining operations. The T-John Mine, the Tom Scott Mine, the Defiance Mine, and the Mystery Mine all opened in the surrounding hills, transforming Gleason from a single operation into a legitimate mining district. The post office reopened on October 15, 1900, and Gleason grew rapidly to support a population that would peak at around 1,000 residents, all of them dependent on copper mining for their livelihoods, in a town that existed solely because John Gleason had looked past the played-out turquoise deposits and seen the real wealth waiting deeper in the mountain. The Copper Bell shaft was dug to 400 feet. The Pemberthy shaft went even deeper at just over 600 feet, and the interconnected underground workings eventually totaled more than 7 miles of tunnels carved through rock that yielded copper, lead, silver, and zinc in combinations that kept the mines profitable even when individual metal prices fluctuated. By 1912, Gleason was thriving in ways that few Arizona mining towns managed, with substantial infrastructure that included a 2-story schoolhouse, a hospital, a saloon, an assayer's office, a movie theater, stores, homes, a jail built from concrete in 1910 to replace the earlier wooden structure that had itself replaced the original jail, which was nothing more than a cable wrapped around an oak tree, and a Southern Pacific Railroad spur that ran directly to the mines to transport ore to smelters. The town had survived the turquoise bust, transformed itself into a copper producer, and seemed positioned to continue operating as long as the ore held out, which geological surveys suggested would be decades at minimum given the depth and extent of the mineral deposits. Nobody expected what happened on an otherwise ordinary day in 1912, when fire broke out in the business district and began spreading through Gleason's tightly packed wooden structures with a speed and ferocity that turned the day into a nightmare of flames and smoke and desperate attempts to save anything from the inferno that consumed building after building, with no regard for the years of work and investment they represented. The fire destroyed 28 buildings before it was finally contained, nearly the entire commercial heart of Gleason reduced to ash and charred timber in a matter of hours. The damage was estimated at $100,000, a staggering sum in 1912 that represented not just the physical structures, but the inventory, equipment, records, and personal possessions that had been inside them when the flames came. Some historical accounts describe the fire as suspicious, suggesting it might have been deliberately set rather than accidental, though no arsonist was ever identified or charged, and the question of how the fire started has remained unanswered for over a century. What is certain is that people died in that fire, though the exact number and their identities have been lost to time because Gleason's records burned along with everything else, and the territorial newspapers that covered the disaster focused on property damage rather than casualties, treating the deaths of miners and their families as less newsworthy than the economic impact on copper production. The few surviving accounts mention bodies recovered from collapsed buildings, victims who'd been trapped by falling timbers or overcome by smoke before they could escape. And at least one story tells of a family that died together when their home burned around them. Parents and children found later in the ruins holding each other in their final moments as the fire consumed everything they'd built in Gleason. The town rebuilt quickly because the mines were still producing ore in large volumes, and World War I was creating unprecedented demand for copper used in electrical wiring, ammunition casings, and military equipment, making Gleason's output more valuable than ever. The 28 destroyed buildings were replaced with new structures, and Gleason continued operating as if the fire had been nothing more than a temporary setback, an unfortunate incident that was already receding into history as production numbers climbed and copper prices reached wartime highs. John Gleason himself sold out in 1914, having made his fortune and decided to leave the day-to-day operations to the Shannon Copper Company and other corporations that had bought into the district's mining operations. But after the war ended in 1918, copper prices collapsed as military demand evaporated and the market flooded with surplus metal, and the Gleason mines that had seemed so productive suddenly became marginally profitable or actively unprofitable, depending on fluctuating commodity prices that mine operators couldn't control. By the 1930s, the mines had all shut down, unable to compete with larger operations in other states, and Gleason's population drained away as miners and their families moved on to wherever work could be found in Depression-era America. The post office held out until March 31st, 1939, when it finally closed its doors and made Gleason officially a ghost town, though a handful of stubborn residents remained and continue living there today among the ruins of what had been Arizona's seventh largest town during the copper boom. Today, Gleason is accessible via paved road after decades of being reachable only by 18 miles of rough dirt track that kept visitors away and left the ghost town isolated in the rolling hills south of Tombstone. The ruins are extensive and relatively well preserved compared to older Arizona ghost towns where nothing remains but foundations, and visitors can explore the hospital, the saloon, the jail that's been converted into a small museum, the massive foundation where the two-story schoolhouse once stood, and numerous other structures in various states of collapse. Mining remnants are visible throughout the surrounding hills, tailings piles and shaft openings that mark where millions of dollars in copper were extracted before the ore played out and the companies moved on. The cemetery sits west of town on the road to Tombstone, filled with graves marked by weathered stones or simple wooden crosses, some bearing names and dates, while others have been worn blank by decades of sun and wind. But what draws paranormal investigators and draws comments from locals and visitors alike is the phenomenon that gives this story its name: the phantom fire that people report seeing in Gleason long after the 1912 blaze was extinguished and the last ember went cold. The first reports came from residents who still lived in Gleason after it became a ghost town, people who'd stayed through the Depression and the mine closures and the slow decay of everything around them. And they described seeing smoke rising from the ruins of buildings that burned in 1912. Wisps of gray and white that appeared at dusk and disappeared when approached, as if the fire was still burning, somewhere just beyond perception. Others reported seeing an orange glow emanating from empty lots, where the 28 destroyed buildings once stood, a flicker of firelight that shouldn't exist because there's nothing left to burn, in spaces that are just desert dirt and scattered foundation stones. The glow appears most frequently in the evening as the sun sets, creating an atmosphere where natural twilight blends with supernatural light in ways that make witnesses question what they're actually seeing, and some describe the glow as pulsing or moving, as if flames are spreading through structures that exist only in the past. Modern visitors to Gleason report the same phenomena: smoke and light appearing without source in locations that correspond to where the business district stood before the fire consumed it. And the experiences are consistent enough across decades and across witnesses who have no connection to each other that dismissing them as suggestion or imagination becomes difficult. More disturbing are the reports of apparitions appearing in conjunction with the phantom fire, figures that witnesses describe as burned or burning, people moving through the ruins with jerky, panicked motions, as if they're still trying to escape flames that consumed them over a century ago. The figures never speak and don't acknowledge living witnesses, moving through their death throes in what paranormal researchers classify as residual hauntings, psychic recordings of traumatic events playing out repeatedly without conscious awareness. Some visitors report experiencing intense heat in areas where the phantom glow appears, temperatures that spike suddenly and drop just as quickly for no reason the weather or environment can explain, as if they're standing near an invisible fire that radiates warmth without producing visible flames. Others describe the smell of smoke and burning wood manifesting in Gleason's ruins, acrid and overwhelming for a few moments before vanishing completely, leaving behind nothing but the normal desert sense of creosote and dust. Photography in Gleason has captured unexplainable anomalies that resemble fire and smoke in images where nothing was visible to the naked eye when the photos were taken. Light streaks and shadow patterns that suggest flames and heat distortion appearing on cameras and phones in ways that skeptics attribute to lens flare or digital artifacts, but which occur too consistently and in too specific locations to dismiss entirely. The jail museum contains artifacts from Gleason's operational years, items salvaged from the ruins and donated by families who left when the mines closed, and some docents who volunteer there report feeling watched when they're alone in the building, particularly in the late afternoon when shadows lengthen. The light takes on the orange quality that matches witnesses' descriptions of the phantom fire glow. The hospital ruins are considered especially active, with multiple visitors reporting overwhelming feelings of sadness and pain when exploring what's left of the structure, emotions that make sense, given that burn victims from the 1912 fire would have been brought there for treatment, that 1912 medicine was largely unable to provide for injuries that severe and extensive. Local paranormal researchers who've investigated Gleason believe the 1912 fire created the kind of mass trauma event that generates persistent paranormal activity, multiple deaths occurring simultaneously in conditions of extreme fear and pain The kind of psychic imprint that doesn't fade over time but actually seems to grow stronger as the physical evidence of the event disappears, and all that remains is the energy of what happened. The fact that Gleason rebuilt after the fire and continued operating for decades might have temporarily suppressed the paranormal activity through the presence of living people and ongoing daily routines. But once the town died completely, and silence replaced the noise of human occupation, the echoes of the fire came back. Manifestations that had been waiting 70 years to emerge once there was nobody left to witness them except occasional visitors who come looking for ghost town history and find themselves confronting a fire that ended in 1912, but somehow never really stopped burning in a town where smoke still rises from empty lots and light still flickers where buildings once stood, and the dead still run through flames that only they can feel, trapped in a loop of burning and dying that plays out at dusk in Gleason, Arizona, the town that John Gleason built on copper and the fire destroyed but couldn't quite extinguish. George Mitchell was a promoter first and a mining man second, which is why when he founded Swansea in 1909 in the remote desert hills of western Arizona Territory, he spent money on spectacle rather than substance, building a town designed to impress investors from San Francisco and New York, rather than actually turn a profit from the copper ore buried in the surrounding mountains. The Clara Consolidated Gold and Copper Mining Company that Mitchell incorporated was a marvel of promotional excess, and he named the town after Swansea, Wales, the copper smelting capital of the world, where Arizona ore had previously been shipped for processing. A journey of over 4,900 miles by rail and ship around Cape Horn that made no economic sense, but sounded impressive in investment prospectuses. Mitchell's plan was to eliminate that absurd shipping route by building a massive 700-ton smelter right there in the Arizona desert, along with all the infrastructure a modern industrial town required. An electric light company in 1909, when most Arizona settlements still used kerosene lamps. A railroad spur connecting to the Arizona and Swansea line that linked to the Colorado River. A lumber company, saloons, restaurants, a general store, a dairy, a movie theater showing the latest pictures from Hollywood, a barbershop, an insurance agency, and even an automobile dealership selling cars in a desert location 30 miles from anywhere that required rough dirt roads to reach. The town grew rapidly to 750 residents at its peak, miners and their families drawn by wages that seemed generous, and the promise of steady work in a company town that appeared prosperous and permanent. And for a brief moment, Swansea looked like it might actually succeed where so many other Arizona mining ventures had failed. But the numbers never worked, and Mitchell either didn't understand basic mining economics or didn't care, as long as the investment money kept flowing in from back east, where wealthy men bought shares in Clara Consolidated based on promotional materials that emphasized the town's amenities rather than actual ore production figures. The cost per pound to extract and process Swansea's copper exceeded the market price of copper by 3 cents, which meant every pound produced represented a loss rather than a profit, and no amount of promotional spending or impressive infrastructure could change that fundamental economic reality. Mitchell kept pouring money into improvements meant to attract more investors, building more structures, and expanding the smelter's capacity while the mines themselves operated with inadequate equipment and inefficient processes that should have been the priority if turning a profit was actually the goal. By 1911, just 2 years after Swansea's founding, the Clara Consolidated Gold and Copper Mining Company was in serious financial trouble, hemorrhaging money on a mining operation that looked successful from the outside but was actually failing catastrophically at the basic task of extracting copper at a competitive cost. The company collapsed in 1912, closing the mines and leaving 750 residents suddenly unemployed in a town 30 miles from anywhere, a company town that existed solely because of the mines and had no reason to continue once the copper stopped flowing. A new owner attempted to restart operations later in 1912, but that effort failed almost immediately, and Swansea sat empty until 1914, when the American Smelting and Refining Company bought the properties and decided to try again, this time with actual mining professionals managing operations rather than promoters focused on attracting investment capital. The town rebuilt, population returned, and for several years, Swansea operated as a legitimate mining town producing copper for World War I military contracts that made the operation profitable despite the high production costs that had doomed Mitchell's venture. But after the war ended in 1918, copper prices collapsed as military demand evaporated and the market flooded with surplus metal from operations that had expanded to meet wartime needs. And suddenly Swansea's marginal profitability disappeared entirely. The town went into steep decline through the early 1920s as workers left for better opportunities elsewhere, and the mines operated sporadically whenever copper prices spiked enough to make production temporarily worthwhile. The post office closed on June 28, 1924, officially marking Swansea as abandoned, and by 1937 the last mining operations had ceased permanently, leaving the town completely empty except for the massive concrete and brick ruins of the smelter complex that had cost so much to build and produced so little actual profit during its brief operational life. Today, Swansea is managed by the Bureau of Land Management as the Swansea Town Site Special Management Area, protected from vandalism and deterioration as much as possible, given that the desert has been reclaiming the ruins for nearly 90 years since the last residents departed. The remains are extensive because Mitchell built so much infrastructure to impress investors, and what's left is one of Arizona's largest and best-preserved ghost towns, with over a dozen adobe structures still standing in various states of collapse, rows of single miners' quarters with BLM restored roofs to prevent further decay, massive concrete foundations where the smelter complex once stood, the remains of the railroad depot, 2 cemeteries with weathered graves, numerous covered mine shafts marked by elaborate grates and fencing, and scattered throughout the site the rusted carcasses of automobiles that were parked and abandoned when their owners left, now slowly being consumed by sand and sun. The BLM has established an interpretive trail with signs marking what each structure was and providing historical information, creating a self-guided tour through Swansea's brief and ultimately tragic history as a town that should never have existed but did anyway because George Mitchell needed something impressive to show investors and didn't particularly care whether the economics made sense. The isolation that protected Swansea from complete destruction by vandals and souvenir hunters also makes it deeply unsettling to visit, because the nearest paved road ends miles away, and the final approach requires navigating rough desert track through landscape that feels actively hostile, all exposed rock and harsh sun, and the kind of emptiness that makes you understand why so many Arizona mining towns failed. Reaching Swansea requires commitment and preparation, not the kind of casual visit you can make to more accessible ghost towns, and that remoteness contributes to the atmosphere of abandonment and decay that permeates the ruins. The sense that you're visiting a place that wanted to be forgotten and resents intrusion by the living who come to gawk at its failure. The BLM maintains 5 designated camping spots for visitors willing to spend the night among the ruins, and it's the overnight campers who report the most disturbing paranormal activity, phenomena that seem to intensify after dark when the desert temperature drops and shadows lengthen across structures that haven't housed living people since the 1920s. The most consistent reports involve sounds echoing from the ruins at dusk, mechanical noises that suggest the smelter operating at full capacity, even though the massive brick structure has been cold and silent for nearly a century. Witnesses describe hearing the roar of furnaces and the clang of metal on metal, industrial sounds that build to overwhelming volume before cutting off abruptly, leaving silence that feels heavier than it should after such noise. The sounds don't correspond to wind or any natural phenomenon that could explain them, appearing on still evenings when there's no breeze to rattle loose metal or create acoustic effects through the ruins' many empty doorways and windows. Other visitors report hearing voices coming from the miners' quarters, conversations in tones too low to make out words, but clearly human. Multiple speakers talking over each other in the pattern of crowded barracks where men lived in close quarters and privacy was impossible. When investigators approach the quarters to identify the source, the voices stop immediately, and searching the small rooms reveals nothing that could have produced the sounds, just empty adobe spaces with BLM-restored roofs and desert wind moving through gaps in walls that are slowly crumbling despite preservation efforts. Shadow figures appear throughout Swansea after dark, human shapes moving with purpose through the ruins as if they're still performing the daily routines that defined life in a company mining town, walking between the quarters and the smelter complex, moving along paths that correspond to where streets once ran, congregating in areas where the saloons and stores stood before decay and salvage reduced them to foundations. The figures don't interact with witnesses and don't seem aware they're being observed, moving through their routines like actors in a play that's been running for 90 years without an audience, and attempting to photograph them produces disappointing results. Images that show empty ruins without any sign of the shadows that were clearly visible moments before. The sensation of being watched is constant in Swansea, reported by nearly every visitor who spends significant time exploring the ruins. An awareness of unseen attention that comes from no identifiable source, but feels intense and sometimes threatening, as if whatever presence remains in the ghost town is monitoring intruders and evaluating their intentions. Some campers report feeling actively unwelcome, experiencing increasing anxiety and discomfort that builds throughout the evening until they pack up and leave despite having planned to stay the night, driven away by psychological pressure that has no rational explanation but feels too real to ignore. The two cemeteries are particularly active, though disappointingly few graves are marked with identifiable stones or markers, most having been worn blank by decades of weather, or having been simple wooden crosses that rotted away long ago, leaving behind only depressions in the desert soil where bodies were buried. The lack of identification makes it impossible to know who's buried in Swansea's graveyards, how many died during the town's operational years, or what killed them, whether mining accidents or disease or the 100 other ways frontier life could end suddenly in remote Arizona territory. But visitors to the cemeteries report inexplicable cold spots that appear without warning, temperatures dropping dramatically in localized areas for no reason the desert climate can explain, and some describe feeling hands touching them when nobody is standing near enough to make physical contact. Unexplained lights appear among the graves after dark, not flashlights or vehicle headlights, but smaller points of illumination that move independently and disappear when approached, leading some paranormal researchers to classify them as spirit orbs or manifestations of energy from the dead who remain tied to their burial sites. The massive concrete foundations of the smelter complex are where the industrial sounds are loudest and where the feeling of being watched becomes most intense. And it's also where multiple visitors have reported experiencing sudden, overwhelming emotions that seem to come from outside themselves. Profound sadness mixed with anger and a sense of betrayal. Feelings that make sense when you consider that Swansea's workers were sold a dream by George Mitchell and given instead a company town built on flawed economics that collapsed within 3 years, leaving them jobless in the middle of the desert. The miners who came to Swansea believed they were building something permanent, investing their labor and their lives in a town that appeared prosperous and well-established, only to discover they'd been props in Mitchell's promotional scheme, expendable components in a venture designed to attract investment capital rather than actually produce copper at a profit. That kind of betrayal and wasted effort might be exactly the type of traumatic experience that generates persistent paranormal activity. The anger and disappointment of hundreds of workers whose dreams died in the Arizona desert, imprinting itself on the ruins they left behind when economic reality finally caught up with promotional fantasy. Arizona Highways has called Swansea one of the state's best ghost towns, praising the extensive ruins and the BLM's preservation efforts. But what the magazine doesn't mention is the Swansea is also widely considered one of Arizona's most haunted locations, a reputation that grows stronger every year as more visitors report experiences that defy conventional explanation. The remoteness that protected Swansea's physical structures from vandalism also seems to have preserved its paranormal activity, isolating the haunting in a way that allows it to intensify without the dispersing effect that comes with heavy tourist traffic and constant human presence. And spending a night alone among Swansea's ruins means confronting whatever remains of the town's brief tragic existence. Listening to phantom smelters process copper that stopped flowing in 1937, watching shadow figures perform routines that ended when the post office closed in 1924, and feeling the anger of workers betrayed by a promoter who built them a beautiful town that was designed to fail from the moment George Mitchell spent money on electric lights in automobile dealerships instead of proper mining equipment and efficient ore processing. Fairbank existed for one reason, and one reason only. Tombstone needed a railroad connection and couldn't get one directly because the terrain was too difficult to run tracks through the hills where the silver mines operated. So the New Mexico and Arizona Railroad built its line along the San Pedro River instead and established Fairbank in 1881 as the transfer point, where Tombstone's ore would be loaded onto trains and supplies for Tombstone's 14,000 residents would be offloaded for the final leg by stagecoach. Nathaniel Kellogg Fairbank, a Chicago businessman who'd invested heavily in Tombstone's Grand Central Mining Company, provided funding for the railroad and the town that would bear his name, creating a settlement that was never meant to be anything except a functional necessity, a place where rails met roads and commerce moved in both directions. The town that grew around that railroad depot never exceeded 100 residents at its peak, but what it lacked in population, it made up for in infrastructure because Fairbank needed to support the constant traffic between the railroad and Tombstone, a Wells Fargo office to handle valuables and money transfers, a general store stocked with goods for miners and their families, a butcher shop, a restaurant, a saloon where stagecoach drivers and railroad workers drank while freight was being transferred, a post office that opened in 1883 and made Fairbank official, a schoolhouse where children of railroad employees and a few ranching families attended classes, taught by teachers who lived in what was essentially a company town, serving a larger company town 12 miles away. Fairbank's most notable moment in history happened on February 15, 1900, when the Burt Alvord gang attempted to rob the express car on the Benson-Nogales train during a scheduled stop at the Fairbank Depot, targeting the shipment of gold and silver bullion that regularly passed through on its way to Eastern Banks. The robbery was well planned and should have succeeded because Alvord himself had been a deputy sheriff and knew how Wells Fargo shipments were handled. But what the gang didn't account for was Jeff Milton, the Wells Fargo express messenger riding that particular train, a man who'd built a reputation as one of the most fearless and skilled gunfighters in Arizona territory. When the train pulled into Fairbank and the gang opened fire, Milton grabbed his shotgun and returned fire from inside the express car, even after taking a bullet to his left arm that shattered the bone and should have incapacitated him, and his shooting was so accurate and so devastating that the gang fled without securing any of the valuables they'd come to steal, leaving Milton bleeding but victorious, and cementing Fairbanks Place in Old West lore as the site of a failed train robbery that demonstrated why you didn't mess with Wells Fargo when men like Jeff Milton were on duty. Milton survived his injuries despite nearly bleeding to death during the hours it took to get him to medical attention, and the Alvord gang was eventually tracked down and prosecuted, ending their short careers as train robbers with prison sentences that removed them permanently from Arizona's criminal landscape. But the train robbery was an anomaly, a single dramatic incident in a town whose normal existence was defined by routine rather than excitement. The daily business of moving freight and passengers between the railroad and the stagecoach line without incident or adventure, and that routine continued until Tombstone's silver mines flooded in the late 1880s and production dropped so dramatically that there wasn't enough ore to justify keeping the railroad spur open. Fairbank declined immediately, but survived in diminished form because the railroad still passed through, even if it wasn't stopping as frequently, and a few ranching families used the town as their mailing address and supply point, keeping the population just barely above zero through the early 20th century. The town got a brief second life in the 1910s and 1920s, when attempts were made to reopen Tombstone's mines using modern pumping technology, and Fairbanks saw increased traffic again as equipment and workers moved through on their way to the silver operations. But those attempts ultimately failed, and by the late 1920s, Fairbank was essentially abandoned except for a handful of holdouts who remained because they had nowhere else to go or refused to admit that the town was finished. The schoolhouse closed in 1944 after operating for 60 years, the last students being bused to Tombstone because there weren't enough children left in Fairbank to justify keeping a teacher employed. And the post office shut down shortly after, officially marking the town as dead, even though a few adobe structures still stood and would continue standing for decades thanks to the dry Arizona climate that preserved them better than weather would have in wetter regions. What killed Fairbank permanently wasn't economic decline, but legal complications involving the land itself, because the entire town site had originally been part of a Mexican land grant from 1823, and when those old Spanish and Mexican land claims were finally adjudicated in the 1960s and 1970s, the ruling determined that the town of Fairbank technically sat on land that belonged to the Wickedest Ranch, giving the ranch legal ownership of all structures and improvements within the town boundaries. The ranch exercised its rights by systematically tearing down most of Fairbank's remaining buildings, salvaging materials, and clearing the land for cattle grazing, destroying decades of history and leaving only a handful of adobe structures that were too deteriorated or too much trouble to completely demolish. The railroad depot where Jeff Milton fought off the Alvord gang was accidentally burned in the 1980s, removing the most historically significant structure and leaving behind only the foundation where trains once stopped and express cars once transferred their valuable cargo. By the time the Bureau of Land Management acquired Fairbank in 1989 and designated it as part of the San Pedro Riparian National Conservation Area, most of the town was already gone, erased by the Wickedest Ranch's demolition crews, and what the BLM inherited was essentially ruins and memories, ghost town remnants that they've worked to preserve and interpret for visitors who hike the trails through what's now considered one of southern Arizona's best preserved ghost towns, despite the fact that almost nothing is actually preserved. The BLM restored the schoolhouse in 2007, reconstructing doors and windows to match the originals, and furnishing it with period desks from Tombstone and blackboards from the Lowell School in Bisbee, creating a museum space that gives visitors some sense of what frontier education looked like when Fairbank was operational. The few remaining commercial buildings that once housed the post office, saloon, and general store still stand in various states of collapse, their adobe walls slowly melting back into the desert as weather erodes what the ranch demolition crews left behind. But the most intact and most disturbing remnant of Fairbank isn't in the town itself, but about half a mile up a hiking trail on a sun-baked hillside where the Fairbank Pioneer Cemetery sits isolated and exposed, a collection of approximately 60 graves in various states of desecration and vandalization that represent everyone who died in or near Fairbank during its operational years and couldn't afford to be buried somewhere more respectable. The cemetery is a depressing place, even by ghost town cemetery standards, with only a few graves marked by identifiable stones or iron fencing, while the majority are unmarked except for piles of rocks or wooden crosses that rotted away decades ago, leaving behind only depressions in the hard-packed earth, where bodies were buried and then forgotten. The Arizona Pioneer Cemetery Research Project has identified 6 memorials, 27 adult males, 12 adult females, 4 male children, and various other burials based on ground-penetrating surveys and historical records. But most of those buried in Fairbank Cemetery will remain forever anonymous because their markers disappeared or were never substantial enough to survive a century of weather and neglect. What makes the cemetery particularly grim is the extensive vandalization it suffered over the years, grave robbery, and deliberate destruction that has scattered bones and disturbed burial sites, turning what should be a peaceful resting place into something that feels violated and angry, a space where the dead were denied even the minimal dignity of undisturbed graves. Some of the disturbance might be attributed to natural causes like erosion and burrowing animals, but other damage is clearly intentional. Fencing torn down, grave markers smashed or stolen, and burial sites excavated by people looking for artifacts or simply vandalizing for the sake of destruction, creating a cemetery that feels cursed not by supernatural forces, but by human disrespect for the dead. And yet, despite the desecration, or perhaps because of it, the Fairbank Cemetery has developed a reputation for paranormal activity that keeps locals away after dark and gives visitors who make the half-mile hike from town an experience they describe in terms of dread and unease that goes beyond the natural reaction to visiting an abandoned graveyard. The most consistent reports involve lights appearing among the graves at night. Not flashlights or vehicle headlights, but small orbs of illumination that move independently through the cemetery, floating above burial sites, or between markers and patterns that suggest intelligence rather than random movement. Witnesses describe the lights as varying in color from white to blue to orange, appearing without warning and disappearing just as suddenly, and attempting to approach them results in the lights retreating or vanishing entirely, as if whatever is generating them is aware of being observed and doesn't want close examination. Some paranormal researchers classify these as spirit orbs, manifestations of energy from the dead who remain tied to their burial sites, while skeptics attribute them to swamp gas or chemical reactions in the soil, though neither explanation satisfies witnesses who've seen the lights move with apparent purpose through a cemetery located on a dry hillside where swamp gas shouldn't exist. Beyond the lights, visitors report hearing whispers in the cemetery, voices speaking too quietly to make out words but clearly present, multiple speakers conversing in the darkness among graves where nobody living should be, and the whispers stop immediately when visitors call out or try to identify their source. Shadow figures appear among the burial sites, human shapes that move through the cemetery as if tending to graves or searching for something, and these figures lack the definition and solidity of living people, appearing more as suggestions of human form than actual bodies. The sensation of being watched is overwhelming in Fairbank Cemetery, reported by virtually everyone who visits. An awareness of unseen attention that comes from multiple directions simultaneously, as if the 60-plus people buried there are all observing intruders who've come to walk among their disturbed and desecrated graves. Some visitors report feeling followed when leaving the cemetery, the sense of pursuit continuing down the trail back toward town, and a few have described feeling hands touching them or tugging at their clothes when nobody is near enough to make physical contact. Experiences that have sent people running back to their vehicles and vowing never to return. The BLM doesn't officially acknowledge the paranormal claims, focusing instead on the historical significance and ecological importance of the San Pedro Riparian Conservation Area, but local ghost hunting groups and paranormal investigators have documented enough activity at Fairbanks Cemetery to place it on lists of Arizona's most haunted locations. The combination of violent history with the train robbery, decades of slow decline and abandonment, systematic destruction by the ranch that legally owned the town site, and extensive desecration of the cemetery has created what paranormal researchers call a perfect storm for persistent haunting. Multiple types of trauma layered on top of each other until the location becomes saturated with negative energy that manifests as lights and shadows and whispers among graves that should be quiet but aren't. Fairbanks was never a large town or an important town except in the limited sense of being functionally necessary to Tombstone's operations, and the people buried in its hillside cemetery were never important people except to their families, who laid them to rest in rocky soil and marked their graves with simple stones that couldn't survive a century of weather and vandalism. And maybe that's exactly why the lights appear and the whispers continue, because Fairbanks and everyone in it were forgotten and erased so completely that the dead themselves refuse to accept their erasure and continue making their presence known to anyone who hikes the half-mile trail to their desecrated resting place and discovers that some places remain haunted, not because of the grand tragedies they witnessed, but because of the small indignity of being forgotten entirely and having even your grave disturbed by people who couldn't be bothered to respect the dead. James Pierce had spent years working as a laborer in Tombstone's silver mines during the boom years, breaking his back underground for wages that barely covered room and board while the mine owners accumulated fortunes. And by 1890, he'd had enough of making other men rich, while his own prospects remained as dark as the tunnels, where he spent 12 hours a day swinging a pick. He and his wife saved every penny they could, operating a boarding house in Tombstone, where miners rented beds, and she cooked meals while Jimmy worked the mines. And finally, in the early 1890s, they'd accumulated enough to purchase ranch land northeast of Tombstone in the Sulphur Springs Valley, a piece of property where they could raise cattle and build a life that didn't depend on digging ore for someone else's profit. The land wasn't particularly promising, just rolling hills in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains covered in scrub brush and dotted with rock outcroppings. But it was theirs, purchased legally with money they'd earned through years of brutal labor and careful saving. And for a brief period, Jimmy Pierce was content to be a rancher rather than a miner, herding cattle across property that represented freedom from the underground darkness that had defined his adult life. Then, on an ordinary morning in 1894, while surveying his land and checking on his cattle, Jimmy noticed something that changed everything. Placer gold lying on the surface of a hillside, free gold just waiting to be picked up, the kind of surface deposit that suggested significant ore bodies existed deeper underground if someone was willing to dig for them. He staked claims immediately, registering them for himself and every member of his family, and named the collection of claims the Commonwealth Mine, creating what would become one of Arizona Territory's most productive gold and silver operations, and sparking a rush that would transform the empty ranch land into a town of 1,500 residents within a few years. The timing was perfect because Tombstone's mines were flooding and production was declining rapidly, creating a population of unemployed miners desperately looking for the next opportunity. And when word spread that Jimmy Pierce had found gold, those miners packed up their belongings and moved northeast to the new settlement that was already being called Pierce in honor of the man whose discovery had created it. The Pierce Post Office opened on March 6, 1896, making the town official in the eyes of territorial authorities, and businesses began appearing along what would become Main Street. The old store, built by the Soto brothers and Charles Renault, Joe Bignon's pioneer saloon after he disassembled his house in Tombstone and hauled it to Pierce, where he reassembled it as the town's first drinking establishment. A mercantile, restaurants, a school, a jail, boarding houses, and eventually even a motion picture theater showing the latest films from the East Coast. The Commonwealth. Mine proved even richer than Jimmy Pierce's initial discovery suggested, with over 20 miles of underground workings eventually carved into the hillside where he'd found that first placer gold, tunnels that would produce more than 1 million tons of ore between 1895 and 1942, yielding approximately $8 million worth of silver and $2.5 million in gold at a time when silver sold for 50 cents per ounce, and gold was $20 per ounce, making the total value astronomical by modern standards. Jimmy Pierce sold his Commonwealth claims for $250,000, a fortune that allowed him to retire comfortably. But his wife insisted on inserting a clause into the sales contract, granting her the exclusive right to operate a boarding house at the mine, ensuring she could continue earning income from the property that had made them wealthy, and that boarding house operated successfully into the 1930s, serving generations of miners who worked the Commonwealth long after the Pierces themselves had moved on. The railroad station opened in Pierce in 1903, connecting the town directly to ore processing facilities and making it easier to ship the massive quantities of silver and gold that continued flowing from the Commonwealth's deep shafts. And by 1919, Pierce had reached its peak population of 1,500, making it one of the more substantial mining towns in southern Arizona Territory, and later Arizona State, after statehood was achieved in 1912. But the Commonwealth mine's success attracted attention beyond legitimate miners and investors, because in a territory where law enforcement was sparse and getting away with theft was easier than working an honest claim, the isolated location of the mine made it a target for claim jumpers, bandits, and opportunists who figured stealing from a productive operation was smarter than gambling on finding their own deposits. The Commonwealth's remote position in the Dragoon Mountains, miles from Pierce proper, and even farther from any real law enforcement presence meant that claim jumpers could move in, work the richest sections of the mine, and disappear before anyone discovered the theft. And during the mine's most productive years, there were multiple attempts to steal ore or claim ownership of sections that legally belonged to the Commonwealth's legitimate owners. Some of those claim jumpers were driven off by armed mine security. Others were arrested and prosecuted in territorial courts. But a disturbing pattern began emerging in the records that miners and locals noticed, even if official documentation was sparse. Claim jumpers who successfully stole from the Commonwealth seemed to die at rates that far exceeded coincidence, meeting their ends in mining accidents, shootouts, or mysterious circumstances that suggested something beyond bad luck was at work. The first deaths were easy to dismiss as frontier justice or simple karma, claim jumpers getting what they deserved through natural consequences of their criminal behavior. But as the body count grew and the pattern became undeniable, locals started talking about a curse associated with the Commonwealth claim, a supernatural protection that Jimmy Pierce had somehow invoked when he staked his original discovery, or that had existed on the land before he found it, tied to the gold itself and defending it against theft with lethal efficiency. Stories circulated about claim jumpers who'd successfully extracted ore from the Commonwealth and gotten away clean, only to die weeks or months later in accidents that shouldn't have been fatal, cave-ins in different mines that killed only them while leaving their partners unharmed, equipment failures that resulted in crushing injuries when identical equipment operated safely for everyone else, falls down mine shafts that killed experienced miners who'd worked underground for decades without incident, and shootouts where claim jumpers took bullets in circumstances that witnesses described as impossibly unlucky, as if the universe itself had aimed the fatal shots. One particularly detailed account tells of 3 men who jumped a section of the Commonwealth in the early 1900s, working it for several weeks and extracting several $1,000s worth of high-grade ore before security finally discovered the theft and ran them off, and all 3 were dead within 6 months. One crushed when a supposedly secured ceiling collapsed in the Copper Queen mine in Bisbee. One shot by a deputy during a saloon fight that multiple witnesses said he hadn't started and shouldn't have been involved in, and one found dead in his tent from what the coroner ruled as heart failure, despite the man being only 35 years old and having no history of heart problems. The legend of the Commonwealth curse grew with each unexplained death, and by the 1920s it was accepted wisdom among southern Arizona miners that you didn't steal from Jimmy Pierce's discovery, no matter how tempting the ore looked, because the Commonwealth protected itself and the protection was fatal. Some attributed the curse to Apache spirits guarding mineral wealth that had been sacred before white settlement. Others claimed Jimmy Pierce himself had made some kind of deal or invocation when he staked his claims, and a few suggested the gold was inherently cursed, and Pierce's success was the exception rather than the rule, that he'd been lucky enough to discover it legitimately, but anyone who tried to steal it triggered whatever supernatural protection existed around the deposit. The mine's legitimate owners denied any curse and attributed claim jumper deaths to coincidence and the inherently dangerous nature of frontier mining. But they also posted prominent warnings at the Commonwealth site and spread stories about the curse themselves, because having potential thieves believe in supernatural protection was cheaper and more effective than hiring additional security guards to patrol miles of remote underground workings. The Commonwealth mine operated profitably until the 1930s, when the Depression made many mining operations economically unfeasible, and production continued sporadically through the early 1940s before shutting down permanently, when World War II regulations closed non-essential mining operations to focus resources on the war effort. Pierce declined immediately, losing population as miners left for war work or other employment opportunities. And by the late 1940s, the town had become almost completely abandoned, earning its designation as a ghost town, even though a handful of residents remained and continue living there today among the historic structures that survived Pierce's boom and bust cycle. The town is now part of the Ghost Town Trail, a driving route through southeastern Arizona that connects Pierce with Gleason and Cortland, other mining settlements that boomed and died during roughly the same period, creating a circuit of abandonment and decay that attracts tourists interested in Old West history and ghost town exploration. Today, Pierce retains several buildings from its operational years, including the remarkable Old Store with its high false front and elaborate tin facade, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, along with Our Lady of Victory Catholic Church, both structures representing the town's brief period of prosperity when 1,500 people believed the Commonwealth mine would keep them employed forever. The mine site itself sits about a mile east of town at what was once called Pittsburgh, and modern explorers who hike to the location report experiencing phenomena that suggest the curse legend might have been more than frontier superstition designed to deter thieves. The most common experiences involve equipment failures that occur specifically at the Commonwealth site, but nowhere else, cameras and phones that malfunction or drain their batteries completely within minutes of arriving at the mine, compasses that spin wildly without settling on any direction, and vehicles that won't start after being parked near the old workings, even though they operated perfectly before arrival and work fine again once moved away from the immediate area. Treasure hunters and metal detector enthusiasts report their equipment producing false readings at the Commonwealth site, indicating valuable deposits that don't actually exist or failing to register anything when visual inspection reveals obvious ore samples, as if something is interfering with detection technology specifically to prevent people from finding and removing gold or silver that might still remain in the abandoned workings. More disturbing are the reports of accidents that shouldn't happen to experienced explorers. People who visited dozens of ghost town mine sites without incident suddenly suffering falls, equipment failures, or near misses that feel less like bad luck and more like active intervention. Warning shots from whatever protects the Commonwealth, telling trespassers to leave before the warnings escalate to the kind of fatal accidents that killed claim jumpers a century ago. Local paranormal investigators who've explored the Commonwealth site describe an atmosphere of hostility and warning, a presence that watches from the tunnels and doesn't want visitors near the remaining ore deposits. And some have documented cold spots and electromagnetic anomalies at the mine entrance that suggest energy concentration without obvious source. The curse that locals whispered about in the early 1900 edition remains active according to those who visit the Commonwealth today. Over 80 years after the mine closed permanently and Jimmy Pierce's discovery stopped producing ore, as if whatever supernatural protection existed around the claim when he staked it in 1894 never expired and continues defending the gold and silver that remain buried in 20 miles of tunnels carved into the hillside where a Cornish miner once found placer gold lying on the surface and started a rush that built a town and created a legend about mineral wealth that protects itself with lethal efficiency against anyone foolish enough to try taking what doesn't belong to them. Chloride holds a distinction that no other Arizona ghost town can claim. It's been continuously inhabited since silver was discovered in the Surbat Mountains in the 1860s, making it the longest continuously inhabited mining town in the entire state and home to the oldest continually operating post office in Arizona, which has been delivering mail without interruption since the early 1870s. That unbroken chain of human occupation, spanning over 160 years, means Chloride isn't technically a ghost town at all, despite the fact that its current population of around 300 residents represents a fraction of the 5,000 people who lived there during the mining boom when over 70 active mines extracted silver, zinc, copper, lead, and turquoise from the surrounding mountains. The town feels like a ghost town because it's so quiet, so empty of the noise and activity that defined frontier mining settlements. But the difference between Chloride and Arizona's truly abandoned ghost towns is that people still live there, retirees mostly, maintaining the old buildings and keeping the post office operational, and serving coffee at yesterday's restaurant, which offers over 120 beers and 40 vodkas to anyone willing to make the drive up Highway 93 from Kingman. What makes Chloride unique among living ghost towns isn't just its continuous habitation, but the fact that the paranormal activity locals describe isn't residual haunting from a dead past, but ongoing phenomena experienced by current residents who've learned to live alongside supernatural presences that apparently never left when the mines closed and the population dwindled. The town's violent origins set the tone for everything that followed, because Chloride was founded through bloodshed in territory that the Hualapai Indians considered their own and weren't willing to surrender without resistance. In the summer of 1863, 6 prospectors began mining silver chloride deposits in the Surbat Mountains, establishing claims in what was explicitly Hualapai territory without permission or negotiation, and the tribe responded exactly as the miners should have expected, with force. 4 of the 6 miners were killed in the attack, crushed, when Hualapai warriors rolled massive boulders down onto the mine shaft where they were working, burying them alive under tons of rock in what must have been a terrifying death as the walls collapsed and the darkness became absolute. The 2 surviving miners, James Conover and Sam Noodles, escaped and immediately brought back cavalry forces to reclaim the mine, sparking years of conflict between white miners and Hualapai defenders that would define the early history of what became Chloride when the town was officially founded in 1863 on land taken by force and held through military presence. The bodies of the 4 killed miners were buried on the spot where they died, their graves lost to time and mining operations that continued extracting silver from the same area where Hualapai warriors had tried to stop the invasion by dropping boulders on trespassers who wouldn't listen to warnings. Just 3 years later, in October 1866, 2 more miners named Metcalf Baker and Andrew Judson were killed by Indians, and their deaths are commemorated by a historical marker that still stands just past Chloride Cemetery, a simple stone stating the facts without elaboration. Metcalf Baker, Andrew Judson, killed by Indians c. 13th, 1866. The marker doesn't explain the circumstances of their deaths or why the Hualapai killed them specifically, but given the pattern of violence surrounding Chloride's founding, it's reasonable to assume Baker and Judson were miners, working claims in territory the tribe was still actively defending, and their deaths represented continued resistance to white settlement that would only end when military force became overwhelming enough that the Hualapai were finally pushed off their ancestral lands entirely. Those 6 deaths in the space of 3 years created Chloride's foundation quite literally through the sacrifice of men who died violently trying to extract mineral wealth from mountains that didn't belong to them. And perhaps it's no surprise that a town built on that kind of violence would carry paranormal activity forward through over a century and a half of continuous habitation. By the late 19th century, Chloride had grown into one of Mojave County's most important settlements, briefly serving as county seat and developing all the infrastructure that boom towns required: hotels, saloons, barbershops, restaurants, a bank, a pool hall, multiple churches, a hospital, a railroad spur connecting to Kingman for ore shipment and supply delivery, and residential neighborhoods where 2,000 people built lives around the assumption that silver mining would continue indefinitely. The town incorporated, established a volunteer fire department that remains the oldest in Arizona, and even attracted the famous Butterfield stage line, which made Chloride a regular stop on routes connecting frontier settlements across the Southwest. But the ore that seemed inexhaustible eventually played out, and by 1917, the population had dropped to 2,000, and the decline accelerated during World War II when mines shut down and workers left to fight or take better-paying defense industry jobs, leaving Chloride nearly abandoned by 1944. The town never quite died because a core population of stubborn residents refused to leave, and through the 1950s and 1960s, Chloride attracted musicians and artists looking for cheap rent and isolation, including Roy Purcell, who painted massive murals called The Journey on a 2,000-foot rock formation in the Surbat Mountains, using automobile paint, creating an artistic landmark that still draws visitors willing to hike or drive the rough road to see his work. Today's Chloride is a strange hybrid of active town and preserved ruin, with 300 residents living among structures from the 1880s and maintaining businesses that serve tourists coming to experience what's marketed as a living ghost town, complete with Saturday gunfight reenactments by the high desert drifters at the replica Old West town called Cyanide Springs. The Jim Fritz Museum, operated by the Chloride Historical Society, opens every Saturday, offering collections of mining artifacts and frontier memorabilia, and yesterday's restaurant serves food and extensive drink selections to travelers who've made the detour off Highway 93 to see Arizona's oldest continuously inhabited mining town. But underneath the tourist-friendly surface and the retiree population that keeps the town alive, current residents will tell you that Chloride is genuinely haunted in ways that go beyond atmosphere or historical reputation, that living in a town founded on violence and sustained through a century and a half of continuous human presence, hasn't dispersed the supernatural activity, but has instead created a situation where the living and the dead occupy the same space simultaneously. The most active location is the area around the historical marker where Metcalf Baker and Andrew Judson were killed, a site that locals avoid after dark because of consistent reports of apparitions appearing near the marker, shadowy figures that witnesses describe as Native American rather than white miners, suggesting that the Hualapai warriors who defended their territory continue maintaining a presence at the spot where they killed trespassers in 1866. The figures don't approach witnesses, but stand at a distance watching, and some visitors report hearing voices speaking in languages they don't recognize, possibly Hualapai or other tribal dialects, as if the dead are still discussing the invasion of their territory and the violence they used to try stopping it. The cemetery itself generates its own paranormal claims, with unexplained lights appearing among the graves and the sensation of being watched by multiple presences simultaneously, though identifying individual spirits is complicated by the fact that many graves are unmarked or marked with weathered stones that no longer bear readable names. Throughout Chloride's residential areas, current inhabitants describe regular paranormal experiences that they've learned to accommodate rather than fear. Footsteps on wooden floors in houses where nobody is walking, doors opening and closing without physical contact, the smell of tobacco smoke in buildings where smoking hasn't been permitted for decades, and most commonly, the feeling of being observed by unseen entities that share living spaces with the town's 300 residents. Restaurant and store owners report objects moving when nobody is nearby, merchandise rearranging itself overnight, and cold spots appearing in specific locations that remain cold regardless of heating or seasonal temperature. The yesterdays, restaurant staff and patrons have experienced collective paranormal events where everyone present simultaneously hears unexplained sounds or feels temperature drops that can't be attributed to HVAC systems or weather, creating shared experiences that can't be dismissed as individual imagination or suggestion. What distinguishes Chloride from Arizona's abandoned ghost towns is that the paranormal activity isn't isolated to occasional visits by investigators or tourists, but is ongoing daily experience for residents who've chosen to remain in a town that most people abandoned decades ago, creating a unique situation where living humans have adapted to supernatural presence rather than fleeing from it. The 300 people who call Chloride home today aren't there because they're unaware of the haunting. They're there despite it, or perhaps because of it, choosing to maintain Arizona's oldest continuously inhabited mining town, even though that continuity apparently includes sharing space with the spirits of miners who died extracting silver from mountains that the Hualapai defended with violence, warriors who killed trespassers and were memorialized with simple markers, and the accumulated psychic residue of over 160 years of continuous human occupation in a location where violence founded the town, and death was common enough that the cemetery filled steadily from 1863 through the present. Route 66 cuts through Oatman on a stretch of road so treacherous that locals call it Bloody 66. 10 miles of hairpin curves and blind corners carved through the Black Mountains, where one mistake sends vehicles tumbling down slopes too steep for rescue, and the fact that this mining town survived at all after gold production ended is largely because tourists kept coming to experience what remained of Old West authenticity, in a place where wild burros outnumber human residents, and a hotel that hasn't offered overnight accommodations in decades still serves drinks in a saloon where $300,000 bills cover every inch of the walls and ceiling. The town that exists today barely resembles the settlement of 10,000 people that flourished during the 1930s when Oatman's gold mines were producing $40 million worth of ore at modern valuation, creating a boom that attracted Clark Gable and Carol Lombard, who honeymooned at the Oatman Hotel in 1939 after their wedding in Kingman, and apparently loved the place so much that they've refused to leave even after death separated them, and decades passed since either was alive. The town's name itself carries darkness, chosen to honor Olive Oatman, a young Illinois woman kidnapped by Apache raiders in 1851, 280 miles away, held in slavery for years, and eventually returned to white society, bearing facial tattoos that marked her captivity and made her famous throughout the nation as a symbol of frontier violence and survival. That the town would choose to name itself after trauma rather than prosperity or hope seems fitting given what Oatman would become, a place where gold fever attracted thousands only to abandon them when the mines closed, where Route 66 brought prosperity until Interstate 40 bypassed the town entirely in the 1950s and left it dying, where the population collapsed from thousands to barely 100 residents who've chosen to remain in what's officially labeled a ghost town despite being technically inhabited. The Oatman Hotel sits at the center of everything, a two-story adobe structure originally built in 1902 as the Derlin Hotel by founder John Derlin, destroyed in the massive fire that swept through Oatman in 1921 and rebuilt in 1924 with the same thick walls and simple architecture that characterized frontier accommodations when comfort mattered less than survival. The building is the only historic two-story adobe structure remaining in Mojave County, listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1983, and it's become Oatman's primary attraction for reasons that extend beyond historical significance into paranormal territory that draws ghost hunters and curiosity seekers in equal measure. The saloon on the first floor operates as it did during mining days, serving drinks and food to tourists who come to experience authentic Route 66 atmosphere, and the walls and ceiling are covered with dollar bills that miners started leaving decades ago, signing and dating their currency and stapling it up so they'd have drinking money when they returned from the mines, creating a tradition that continues today with 300,000 bills documenting visits spanning generations. The second floor, closed to overnight guests but accessible as a museum, contains 8 rooms, including the Gable Lombard honeymoon suite, where the famous couple spent their wedding night. And it's on this upper floor where the paranormal activity concentrates most intensely, though manifestations occur throughout the entire building with enough frequency that staff and regular patrons have learned to accept ghostly presence as part of working at Arizona's most haunted hotel. Clark Gable and Carol Lombard's ghosts are the hotel's most famous spirits, reported by countless witnesses who describe hearing their voices whispering and laughing in empty rooms, particularly in the honeymoon suite, where they apparently experienced happiness significant enough to anchor their spirits to the location even after Lombard's tragic death in a 1942 plane crash, and Gable's death nearly 2 decades later. Visitors to the suite report feeling watched by invisible presences, experiencing sudden temperature drops without explanation, and hearing conversations in tones too low to make out words, but clearly involving 2 people engaged in intimate discussion, as if Gable and Lombard continue enjoying their honeymoon in whatever reality spirits inhabit when they're not manifesting for living witnesses. The phenomenon suggests they remain in love beyond death, bound together by the joy they experienced during their brief stay in Oatman. And some paranormal researchers believe strong, positive emotions can anchor spirits just as effectively as trauma or violence, creating hauntings based on happiness rather than horror. The fact that Gable returned to Oatman repeatedly after his honeymoon, coming back to play poker with local miners, and developing genuine affection for the town adds credibility to claims that he chose to remain there spiritually, finding more peace in a small mining town's hotel than anywhere else his fame took him during his lifetime. But the Gable Lombard spirits share the hotel with considerably less romantic presences, including Odie, The Irish miner, whose ghost has become so famous that he's essentially Oatman Hotel's resident poltergeist, accepted by staff as part of the building's character rather than something threatening or malevolent. Odie is believed to be William Ray Flower, an Irishman who lived at the hotel while working local gold claims and died behind the building after drinking himself into fatal alcohol poisoning, collapsing in the alley where his body was discovered hours or days later, depending on which version of the story you hear. His spirit manifests through poltergeist activity rather than visual apparition, pulling sheets off display beds on the second floor, opening and closing the window in what was his room during life, and generally making his presence known through physical manipulation of objects rather than appearing to frighten witnesses. Staff describe Odie as friendly, if mischievous, more interested in reminding people he's still around than causing actual problems, and the hotel has embraced him as part of the attraction, marketing his presence alongside the Gable Lombard honeymoon suite as reasons to visit Oatman's most haunted location. More disturbing is the presence of the murdered chambermaid, a woman whose identity has been lost to time but whose death apparently occurred within the hotel under violent circumstances that created a haunting characterized by desperation rather than mischief or romance. Her ghost leaves impressions in the dust on the second floor, body-shaped depressions that appear on floorboards as if someone had been lying there, and the impressions persist even after the dust is cleaned, reappearing in the same location with enough consistency that hotel staff no longer bother trying to eliminate them. Some witnesses report seeing her apparition, a woman in period chambermaid clothing moving through the upstairs rooms as if still performing her duties. And unlike Odie's playful manifestations or the Gable Lombard whispers, encounters with the chambermaid's spirit carry weight of tragedy and unresolved trauma that makes witnesses uncomfortable in ways they struggle to articulate afterward. The fact that she was murdered rather than dying naturally or accidentally seems to have trapped her in a different type of haunting, unable to rest or move on because her death was violent and unjust and apparently never properly investigated or resolved. The saloon generates its own paranormal phenomena independent of the upstairs ghosts, with bartenders reporting objects levitating off the bar without explanation, glasses and cash tips rising into the air before dropping back down, as if invisible hands had lifted them briefly before losing interest. The toilets flush on their own when nobody is in the restrooms, lights turn on and off without anyone touching switches, and disembodied voices carry through the building, speaking words that can't quite be understood, as if multiple spirits are having conversations that living people can only partially perceive. The cumulative effect of all this activity makes the Oatman Hotel one of Arizona's most investigated paranormal locations, attracting ghost hunting groups and television shows looking to document genuine supernatural phenomena in a building where staff and regular patrons will confirm that strange things happen with enough frequency that they've stopped being surprising. Outside the hotel, Oatman itself exists as a quirky tourist destination that's managed to survive through charm and location rather than actual economic necessity, with wild burros descended from miners' pack animals roaming the streets freely, begging food from visitors and posing for photographs in exchange for alfalfa cubes sold by vendors who've turned the burros into Oatman's primary daytime attraction. The burros are descendants of animals that miners abandoned when the gold played out and the population fled, and they've thrived in the Black Mountains, multiplying over decades until they outnumber human residents and essentially own the town, blocking traffic on Route 66 and crowding the wooden sidewalks without concern for the tourism industry that depends on their presence. The contrast between the friendly burros that define Oatman's daytime atmosphere and the haunted hotel that comes alive after dark creates a strange duality where families feed animals in the afternoon and ghost hunters investigate supernatural activity at night, making Oatman simultaneously wholesome and eerie, depending on when you visit and what you're looking for. The town hosts annual events that embrace its quirky reputation, including the July Sidewalk Egg Fry, where eggs cook on pavement, heated to temperatures that make frying without a pan possible, and the September Burrow Biscuit Toss, where participants compete to throw burrow droppings the farthest distance, events that sound absurd, but draw crowds willing to experience authentic small-town Arizona weirdness. Wild West gunfight reenactments occur regularly on Main Street, performed by the High Desert Drifters, and the approximately 100 full-time residents who call Oatman home have built their economy around serving tourists who come for burros and stay for ghosts, or vice versa, maintaining a town that technically died decades ago but refuses to actually die because Route 66 nostalgia and paranormal tourism keep bringing visitors willing to spend money in what guidebooks market as a living ghost town. The Oatman Hotel Restaurant and Bar continues serving food and drinks in a building that's over a century old, where Clark Gable and Carol Lombard still whisper in their honeymoon suite, where Odie still opens windows and pulls sheets off beds, where a murdered chambermaid still leaves impressions in dust that won't stay cleaned, and where bartenders still watch glasses levitate off the bar while they're pouring drinks for tourists who've made the dangerous drive through Bloody 66 to experience a piece of Route 66 history that comes with bonus supernatural activity included in the price of admission. If you've made it this far through 13 stories of Arizona's most haunted ghost towns, then you're part of the horror family here at Verified Souls, and we appreciate you spending time with us exploring the darkest corners of the Old West, where the dead refuse to stay buried, and history echoes through abandoned buildings that remember everything. Make sure you subscribe to Verified Souls for more true paranormal stories from America's most haunted locations. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we post new content, and leave a comment letting us know which of these 13 Arizona ghost towns you'd be brave enough to visit after dark, because we read every comment, and your engagement keeps this channel growing. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember that some places never really die. They just wait in the darkness for someone willing to listen to the stories the living left behind.